3 men had come to the Harrow Ranch that morning, and every one of them arrived with money. The last one, Gerald Whitmore, stepped out of his polished carriage wearing a suit that cost more than Nathan Cole earned in 6 months. He didn't bother to close the gate behind him. He walked straight past 2 ranch hands without acknowledging they existed, climbed the porch steps, and told Silas Harrow's housekeeper to move aside. Not asked, told, before planting himself in the parlor like he already owned the furniture. Nathan watched from the corral fence, 30 yards away, and said nothing. But his jaw tightened, because Gerald Whitmore had done the same thing 3 weeks ago, and 2 weeks before that. Every time he came to court Evelyn Harrow, he treated the hired help like fence posts. Every time Evelyn smiled politely from the doorway and looked just once toward the corral. Nathan always pretended not to notice. He was very good at pretending. All right. If this kind of story moves something in your chest, the kind where the right man is always the last one anyone sees, then hit that like button right now, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't come around every week. Let's begin. The Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1888 was not a place that forgave weakness, and Silas Harrow had built his life on that understanding. He'd come to this land at 22 with a single mule, $40 sewn into the lining of his boot, and a stubbornness that his mother had called a character flaw, and that the frontier had called a survival skill. 40 years later, the Harrow Ranch stretched across 11,000 acres of high plains and rocky river bottom, carrying 1,200 head of cattle under his brand and employing 31 men year-round. He had outlasted drought, blizzard, 3 different waves of land speculators, and one particularly ugly lawsuit over water rights that had gone all the way to the territorial court. He had also outlasted his wife. Margaret Harrow had died of fever 12 years ago, in the same upstairs bedroom where Evelyn had been born. That loss had reshaped Silas in ways that were difficult to explain and easy to see. He spoke less, smiled only when something genuinely earned it, and developed the habit of watching people for long stretches before deciding what to think of them. His ranch hand said he could read a man's character the way a good tracker reads ground, quietly, patiently, and without tipping his hand until he was certain. Evelyn had inherited her mother's face and her father's eyes. Not the color, hers were a deep, unsettled green that caught light the way a river does, but the quality behind them. The capacity to look at something and see past the surface of it to the actual structure underneath. At 24, she was the most sought-after woman in 3 counties without having made the slightest effort toward that status. She didn't attend every dance. She didn't engineer conversations at cattle auctions. She kept the household ledgers, she managed the vegetable garden with the same seriousness her father gave to the pastures, and she read whatever books the traveling merchant brought through, from agricultural manuals to novels to the occasional legal text that she found more interesting than most people expected. The men who came calling rarely understood this. They saw the chestnut hair and the shape of her jaw and the way she stood, straight, unhurried, grounded, and they decided they knew everything they needed to know. They came with gifts and speeches and carefully staged demonstrations of prosperity. Evelyn was polite to all of them. She was also quietly, methodically measuring every single one. Nathan Cole had worked the Harrow Ranch for 3 years. He had arrived in the late summer of 1885 on the back of a roan horse he called Pepper, carrying a bedroll, a change of clothes, a pocket knife, and a small rectangular ledger that the other hands found unusual. He wasn't the largest man on the ranch, or the loudest, or the most experienced. He was 26 then and lean in the way of a man who had worked hard since he was old enough to lift something without supervision. His face carried a quality of stillness that some people mistook for slowness, and that turned out, every time, to be something closer to its opposite. He got the job because he fixed a problem in the first hour. Walt Greer, the foreman at the time, had been struggling all morning to load a skittish mare into the horse trailer for the vet run into Casper. The mare had spooked twice, nearly kicked a post hand in the chest, and was working herself into a state that made the situation worse with every attempt. Nathan arrived, watched for about 45 seconds, then walked to the water trough, wet his hands, and walked back. He didn't go straight to the mare. He stood near her, side on, not making eye contact, not talking, just existing in her space at a distance that didn't threaten. He stood there for 3 minutes. Then he took one step closer, then another. By the time Walt realized what was happening, Nathan had the lead rope clipped and was walking the mare into the trailer like they were old friends. Walt looked at him for a moment and said, "You worked horses before?" "Some," Nathan said. That was a typical Nathan Cole answer, accurate, complete, and roughly one-fifth of what another man would have said. He settled into the bunkhouse without drama. He pulled his weight in the work and a little more. He didn't drink excessively, didn't gamble with the other hand's wages, didn't brag about things he'd done or complain about things that hadn't gone his way. He kept the ledger. It turned out he used it to track the condition of fence sections and the grazing rotation, not because anyone asked him to, but because it helped him do his job better. Walt found this out 6 months in and showed the ledger to Silas without comment. Silas had read it twice before putting it down. "Who does this man think he is?" he asked. "Best I can tell," Walt said. "Just a hand who likes to keep things straight." Silas had filed that information away. He was very good at filing things away. The first time he really watched Nathan with Evelyn was accidental, or at least it started that way. Evelyn had been carrying a crate of jarred preserves from the root cellar to the kitchen, and one of the jars had rolled loose and broken on the stone steps. She was crouched down cleaning up broken glass when Nathan came around the corner of the house with a bucket of well water he'd drawn for the vegetable beds. He stopped. Most men, in Nathan's position, would have made a point of helping, would have set down the bucket with some significance, would have said something warm and useful and designed to be noticed, would have used the moment. What Nathan did was simpler, and in Silas's estimation, considerably more honest. He set the bucket down without ceremony, crouched beside her and said, "You got the big pieces. I'll get the small ones. They'll cut you." And then he just did it, picked the glass fragments out of the gap between the stones, while Evelyn held the crate. And when it was done, he didn't stand around waiting for thanks. He picked up his bucket and kept walking toward the garden. "Thank you," Evelyn said to his back. "Yep," Nathan said, without turning around. Silas, watching from the parlor window, had turned that scene over in his mind for 3 days. By the time Gerald Whitmore made his first visit to the Harrow Ranch, Silas had been quietly observing Nathan Cole for the better part of 14 months. What he'd seen had started to take on a shape that interested him greatly. Gerald Whitmore was the son of a Cheyenne land broker who had done very well in the boom years of the mid-1880s, and the son had grown up understanding that money made noise, and that noise was how you let people know you existed. He was 32, reasonably good-looking in the way that a well-maintained horse is good-looking, clean and assembled and not particularly interesting once you got past the surface. He wore good clothes and rode an impressive horse, and had the kind of voice that was accustomed to filling rooms. He came to court Evelyn with her father's tentative permission, because Silas had not yet built a strong enough reason to say no, and because saying no to a man for no stated reason was its own kind of social complication on the frontier. The first time Gerald came to dinner, he talked for most of the meal about a land deal he was pursuing east of Douglas, about the money involved, and about the ranch he planned to build. He addressed most of this to Silas. He asked Evelyn 3 questions, none of which required more than a yes or no answer, and he didn't appear to notice when she offered more. When he left, Silas sat at the cleared table with his hands folded. "Well?" Evelyn said. "He's got good horses," Silas said. Evelyn laughed, a short, real laugh that she tried to cover with her hand and didn't quite manage. "That's something," she said. "It's a start," Silas agreed, but his eyes were already somewhere else. The second time Gerald came, he arrived with a silver brooch in a velvet box and presented it in front of 3 ranch hands who happened to be nearby. Not coincidentally, Silas suspected. The brooch was expensive, and the gesture was obviously designed to be witnessed. Evelyn thanked him with the particular smile she used when she meant something entirely different from what her face was showing. Nathan was one of the 3 hands nearby. He was cleaning a saddle on the fence rail, and he didn't look up once during the presentation. That evening, Silas walked out to the corral after supper. Nathan was checking a front hoof on Pepper, his roan, with the unhurried attention he gave to all of his equipment. Silas leaned on the fence. "You see that business with Whitmore this afternoon?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Saw it," Nathan said. "What'd you think?" Nathan set the hoof down and straightened up slowly. He didn't look at Silas right away. He ran a hand down the horse's neck instead. "Not my place to think anything," he said. I'm asking your place to think something, Silas said. I'm asking directly. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Man who does a kindness where people can see it, he said finally, and never where they can't. That's not a kind man. That's a man who knows what kindness looks like. Silas said nothing. He watched the cattle in the far pasture for a while. Good horse you've got there, he said eventually. Good horse, Nathan agreed. Silas walked back to the house. He had learned in 40 years of reading people that the hardest thing to fake is consistency. A man could behave generously once. He could behave patiently once. He could speak honestly when the stakes were low. But holding a particular quality across hundreds of small moments, in cold weather and tired mornings, and frustrating work and situations where no one was looking and there was nothing to gain, that was the test that revealed actual character. He had been designing tests for Nathan Cole for over a year. He had not told anyone this. He wasn't certain yet what he intended to do with what he found. The first test had been the money. 3 months after Nathan arrived, Silas had left $32 in mixed bills and coins in the tack room, on the shelf above the bridle hooks, sitting there in plain sight. He told no one it was there. He waited. 2 days later, Nathan found him at the barn door. Something in the tack room someone might be looking for, Nathan said. What kind of something? Cash money, $32. On the shelf. Silas studied him. You counted it. Wanted to be accurate when I reported it. Could have been anyone's. Yes, sir. Which is why I'm reporting it instead of spending it. Silas retrieved the money. He said nothing more about it. But that evening he sat at his desk and wrote one line in his personal journal. N. Cole. Found it, reported it, counted it first so he could be exact. That last detail was what stayed with him. Another man might have rounded up or down when reporting found money to leave a little cushion. Nathan had taken the time to be precise, which meant he had already decided that precision was what the situation required. The second test had come 4 months later, when Silas put Nathan in charge of the 4 best horses on the ranch. His personal string, animals worth somewhere between $800 and $1,200 apiece. He told Nathan to prepare them for the fall drive and said nothing else about supervision. For 11 days, Nathan managed those horses with a degree of care that Walt Greer told Silas about unprompted. Nathan had adjusted the shoeing on 2 of them after noticing mild imbalance in their gait. He changed the feed ratio on the oldest one based on the horse's energy levels. He had written all of it down in his ledger with dates and his reasoning. Silas read the ledger entries and did not ask for the ledger back. The third test was the cattle sale. He gave Nathan responsibility for a mid-season sale, 43 head at a market he'd worked before, all the way to the sale barn and back, with the authority to negotiate final price and handle the payment. $4,200 changed hands. Nathan returned with $4,200, a receipt for every expense from the trip, and 17 cents in leftover coins that he set on Silas's desk without being asked. 17 cents, Silas said. Feed for Pepper cost 3 cents less than I estimated, Nathan said. Lodging came in under 2. That's the difference. Silas looked at the 17 cents. Most men would have rounded down, he said. Most men would have, Nathan agreed, without any particular judgment in his voice. Silas picked up the coins and put them in his desk drawer. He didn't spend them for a year and a half. He kept them because they represented something he couldn't put a simple name to, a kind of integrity that refused to be casual even in small things. The fourth test was the fence. The southwest boundary of the Harrow Ranch ran for nearly 4 miles across terrain that was equal parts beautiful and miserable to work in. Rocky hillside, seasonal creek drainage, stands of scrub pine that made straight lines impossible. 3 successive foremen had tried and failed to complete a proper fence line along that boundary. The first had run out of materials. The second had run out of patience. The third had completed perhaps 2/3 of it before the section he built proved structurally weak and needed to be redone. Silas assigned the task to Nathan in the early spring, gave him a materials list that previous foremen had compiled, and told him he'd have whatever help he needed. Nathan looked at the materials list for a moment. Can I walk the line first? He asked. Walk whatever you need, Silas said. Nathan spent 2 days walking the full 4 miles with his ledger and a hand-drawn map. Then he came back and submitted a revised materials estimate that was 30% less than the previous list. You plan to build a shorter fence? Silas asked. I plan to build a smarter one, Nathan said. The terrain does most of the work in 3 sections if you follow the natural breaks. I drew it out. He showed Silas the map. Silas looked at it for a long time. You've done this before. Not this exact thing, but when you can use what's already there, you use what's already there. Seems wasteful to do it the hard way. He completed the fence in 5 weeks, working with one assistant for the first 3 and alone for the last 2 when the assistant's family emergency called him home. The fence held. More than that, it was clean work, evenly spaced, properly tensioned, posts set at depths that would resist the freeze-thaw cycle that destroyed Wyoming fencing every other year. When he turned in the unused materials, cataloged in his ledger with every item. Silas sat with the list for a long time. He was running out of tests. He was also running out of reasons to pretend he didn't know what the tests were showing him. The problem was that he still didn't know, not with certainty, what Nathan felt about Evelyn. A man's character could be impeccable, and his heart could still be somewhere else entirely. Silas needed to know more than what tests of work and honesty could reveal. He needed to understand what was underneath the stillness. He got part of his answer by accident, in the way that important things often arrive, sideways, when you're looking somewhere else. It was a Thursday evening in late September. Silas had come out to the south pasture after supper to check on a cow that had been showing signs of early labor. He came around the backside of the hay barn quietly, the way he moved everywhere these days, and he stopped. Nathan was sitting on an overturned crate near the pasture fence. He was not working. He was not reading his ledger. He was watching the main house, where the parlor windows were lit against the darkening sky, and through those windows the shape of Evelyn was visible. She was reading, or perhaps sewing, her posture the particular kind of settled that means a person is absorbed in something they actually enjoy. Nathan was watching her the way a man watches something he has decided he has no right to want. There was nothing greedy in it. It was the look of someone saying goodbye to a thing they never held. Silas stood very still. After perhaps 2 minutes, Nathan stood up, picked up the crate, put it back where it belonged, and walked to the bunkhouse without looking back at the house. Silas stayed where he was for a while. He had been asking the wrong question. He had been trying to discover whether Nathan was good enough. He had never stopped to ask whether Nathan had already answered that question himself, quietly, alone, and in the wrong direction. The following morning, he sent word through Walt that he wanted to see Nathan after the midday break. Nathan arrived at the ranch office with his hat in his hand, not in the theatrical way some men held their hats, but the practical way of a man who removes his hat when he enters a building because that is simply what a person does. Silas gestured to the chair across the desk. Nathan sat. For a moment Silas said nothing, which would have made most men uncomfortable, and which Nathan appeared to take as simply more time to be still. You've been on this ranch 3 years, Silas said. 3 years and 2 months, Nathan said. You know this operation as well as anyone here except Walt and myself. Nathan said nothing, which Silas took as agreement without inflation. I've been watching you. Nathan's expression didn't change. I know. That stopped Silas for half a second. You know. The money in the tack room, Nathan said. The horses, the sale, the fence with the reduced materials list. A man doesn't give those kinds of assignments to a hand without a reason, and you don't do anything without a reason. He paused. I figured either you were testing me or you were trying to run me off. Since I'm still here, I concluded the first. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the man across from him with the same careful attention he had been giving him for 14 months. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. Because if I said something, it changes the test, Nathan said. If I behave a certain way because I know someone's watching, that's not character. That's performance. You weren't asking for a performance. Silas was quiet. That's the most sensible thing anyone has said in this office in 2 years, he said. Nathan looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. What was the question exactly? I figured I'd find out eventually. Silas laced his fingers together on the desk and looked directly at him. My daughter, he said. Nathan didn't move. Something shifted behind his eyes, a small tightening, like a man who has just heard the thing he expected and had hoped not to hear. Mr. Harrow. Let me finish, Silas said. I am not a man who goes around the outside of something when I can walk straight through it. So I will be direct. I have watched you for more than a year. I have watched you handle money and animals and hard work and other men. I have watched you in small moments and large ones, and I have watched you watching my daughter. Nathan's jaw tightened. I have not. I said, let me finish. There was no sharpness in Silas's voice, just the particular weight of a man who means what he says. I watched you by the hay barn 3 nights ago. You didn't know I was there. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Nathan held it for a long time. I have not been inappropriate, he said finally, and his voice was careful and quiet and entirely controlled. I have not spoken to her in any way that— I know, Silas said. That's part of what I'm talking about. He looked at Nathan steadily. You've felt something for a considerable amount of time and you have done nothing with it. I want to know why. Nathan put his hat on his knee and looked at it. When he spoke, his voice had a quality Silas hadn't heard from him before, not exactly raw, but unguarded, like the ledger he kept, but for the inside of himself rather than the fences. Because it doesn't matter what I feel, Nathan said. What matters is what I can offer. And what I can offer is a horse, a saddle, these 2 hands, and the fact that I don't lie. He looked up. Your daughter is the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Not just the most beautiful, though she is that, but the way she thinks, the way she runs this house, the way she reads those books and argues with what's in them. A woman like that deserves a man who can give her something real. Land, security, a future that doesn't depend entirely on whether his knees hold out until he's 60. His voice stayed even, but there was a hardness under it, the kind that comes from a decision that cost something. I have nothing to offer your daughter, so I've said nothing, and I'll keep saying nothing. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was working a horse in the yard. The sound of hooves on packed earth came through the window in irregular beats. Silas Harrow sat with his hands folded and looked at the man across from him, and thought about what 40 years of building something had actually taught him versus what he had thought it would teach him when he started. Then he leaned forward. You've spent 3 years on this ranch, he said, and in that time you've done one thing consistently wrong. Nathan waited. You have been measuring your worth, Silas said, in the wrong currency. He let that sit. I spent 20 years, he continued, watching wealthy men make decisions about land and cattle and people. Men with more acres than they could ride in a week and more money than they could spend in a lifetime. And I watched those same men lie to the bank and steal from their neighbors and treat their wives like expensive furniture. I watched fortunes built on paper promises that collapsed the first hard winter. I watched rich men make poor choices and poor men make rich ones. He paused. The man who worked beside me the first 3 years I had this ranch, the man who helped me sink the first fence posts, drive the first cattle, survive the first winter when we lost 40 head to the cold, he had nothing. He had less than you. He is the reason there is a ranch to leave to anyone. He looked at Nathan. What was his name? Nathan asked. Thomas Deere. He died in 1879 of an infection from a wire cut. I still think about him most mornings. Silas's voice held no sentimentality, only fact. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't educated. He wasn't from a good family. He was just a man who meant what he said and did what he promised and never took more than what was his. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the desk. That is rarer than land. That is rarer than money. I have spent 4 decades trying to find that quality in the men around me, and I am telling you that most of them don't have it. Nathan was very still. I've watched you for 14 months, Silas said. I set you problems that have revealed other men's weaknesses every time I've used them. You didn't flinch at any of them. And when I found you by the hay barn 3 nights ago, the thing I saw wasn't a man pursuing something he wanted. It was a man saying goodbye to it because he thought he didn't deserve it. His voice didn't change in volume, but something in it deepened. That is exactly backwards, Nathan. A man who knows he doesn't deserve a thing is usually the man who does. Nathan's hands tightened on his hat. Mr. Harrow, he said, and his voice was careful, but something was working under the surface of it. I appreciate what you're saying. I understand the argument. But understanding an argument and living by it are different things. Even if you believe what you're saying, and I believe that you do, the life I could give her would be— Let me tell you what I think about the life you could give her, Silas said, and then you can tell me I'm wrong. He stood up from behind the desk and walked to the window that looked out over the front yard of the ranch. The sun was past its peak, and the light was long and flat across the grass. This ranch will need a man to run it. I am 61 years old, and I have a heart that is not what it was. My daughter is the most capable person I know, and she will not need saving. But this place, what I've spent my life building, it will need a man she trusts beside her, not a man who owns it, a man who is worthy of working it. He turned from the window. I am not offering you a prize, Nathan. I am asking you whether you are willing to go speak to my daughter honestly, whether you are willing to let her decide what she deserves instead of deciding for her. The silence stretched. Nathan stood up slowly. He turned his hat in his hands once. She might say no, he said. She might, Silas said. That's her right, but it ought to be her choice to make. Nathan looked at him for a long moment. You said, I'm the most honest man in Wyoming, Nathan said quietly. Were you saying that, or were you trying to persuade me? Silas almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile he had produced in a week. Both, he said, but the first one is true regardless of what you do with it. Nathan put his hat back on. He stood straighter than he had when he came in, or maybe it only looked that way because something about him had settled into a different position, like a fence post that's finally seated at the right depth. I'll need to think, he said. Think tonight, Silas said. She reads in the garden most evenings when the weather holds. Tomorrow, it's supposed to hold. Nathan nodded once. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. The 17 cents, he said. You kept them. It wasn't a question. He must have noticed the coins still on the desk the one time he'd been in the office before. I kept them, Silas said. Why? Silas looked at the small stack of coins on the corner of the desk. Because they're the most honest 17 cents I've ever come across, he said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him with the soft, deliberate click of a man who closes doors the way he does everything else, carefully, and without making more noise than the situation requires. Silas sat back down at his desk. He looked at the coins. Outside, the ranch went on with its afternoon. The horses, the cattle, the sound of men working, the long Wyoming light moving slowly across 11,000 acres of land that he had built out of nothing but stubbornness and the willingness to trust the right people. He thought about Thomas Deere, who had died from a wire cut and a bad infection, and who had never owned an acre of anything. He thought about what it meant to be rich. Then he picked up his pen and wrote one more line in his journal. Told him. He listened. He'll do the right thing. He always does. Nathan did not sleep well that night. He lay on his bunk in the far corner of the bunkhouse, listening to the sounds of men sleeping around him, the deep, uncomplicated breathing of men who had spent their physical energy in honest work and had nothing complicated waiting for them in the morning. And he stared at the underside of the bunk above him and tried to think clearly about what Silas Harrow had said. He couldn't quite manage it. Clear thinking requires a certain distance from the subject, and Nathan had no distance from this subject at all. He had been maintaining that distance artificially for over a year, constructing it deliberately the way you build a fence along a boundary you don't actually want to cross, not because the land on the other side is bad, but because it belongs to someone else, and you know your own limits. He had been careful. He had been methodical about it. He had permitted himself exactly the awareness he couldn't avoid. She was present. She was the woman she was. And he was not able to stop knowing that, and he had stopped every single thing past awareness dead in its tracks. And now Silas Harrow had walked up to that fence and asked him why he'd built it. He turned onto his side. Across the bunkhouse, Roy Demps was snoring in the particular rhythm that the other hands had long since stopped complaining about, because complaining had never produced any results. Outside, something moved in the yard, a horse shifting weight, or one of the dogs making its rounds. The wind had picked up after dark and was pushing against the boards of the bunkhouse with a low, persistent pressure. Nathan thought about what Silas had said about Thomas Deere, about the man who had helped build the ranch from nothing and had died from a wire cut and an infection at 50-some years old without ever owning an acre of anything. He thought about what it meant that Silas had brought that man up at all, that in explaining what he valued, Silas Harrow had reached past every wealthy rancher and decorated businessman who had ever worked beside him and landed on a man with empty pockets and a good character. He wasn't sure if that was genuinely comforting or if he was just deciding to hear it that way because he wanted to. That uncertainty was the thing that kept him awake more than anything else. He had not survived 3 years on the Wyoming frontier by fooling himself into believing what was convenient. He had watched other men do that. Decide that the water source was reliable when the signs said it wasn't. Decide that the weather would hold when the clouds said otherwise. Decide that a business arrangement was sound when the other party's history said the opposite. The willingness to tell yourself a flattering story was, in his experience, the most common way a man destroyed himself, and he had worked very hard not to do it. So he lay there and tried to be fair about the question. Did he love Evelyn Harrow? The word felt too small for what he meant, but yes. He had felt something take root in him somewhere in the first several months of being on the ranch. Not from one particular moment, but from 100 small ones stacked on top of each other. The way she handled a household crisis with the same level-headedness her father brought to the cattle operation. The way she argued with books in the margin, which he had seen once when he'd carried a crate of volumes to the parlor, and one had fallen open. The way she was kind to the men without being condescending about it. She knew every hand's name, knew which ones had family somewhere, remembered details she had no particular reason to remember. The way she could be in a room without performing for it. He had registered all of this carefully, over time, and then he had put a fence around the knowing of it and kept working. And what Silas was asking was whether that fence had been wisdom or cowardice. Nathan did not yet know the answer to that question with confidence, but he was starting to suspect it might have been both, which was worse in certain ways than it being cleanly one or the other. He was awake when the first light started coming through the cracks in the bunkhouse boards. He got up, dressed, and went to do morning chores before anyone else was up, because physical work was the most reliable cure he knew for the kind of thinking that went in circles. He fed the horses. He checked the water troughs. He walked the near fence line with no particular assignment because he always walked fence when he needed to think. The repetitive physical action of checking post tension and wire gauge providing just enough occupation for his hands that his mind could work at a lower pressure. He was on the back side of the barn when he heard Gerald Whitmore's carriage before he saw it. It was early, not yet 7, the sun still low, and the air still carrying the cold edge of a Wyoming autumn morning. And the carriage was moving fast, which was unusual. Most visitors to the Harrow Ranch came in at a reasonable pace, partly out of courtesy, and partly because the road from the main gate was uneven enough that speed was its own punishment. Whitmore's driver was pushing the horses harder than the road warranted. They came through this gate in a rattle of wheel and harness, and the carriage pulled up to the front of the house, not so much stopping as skidding into position. Nathan stood at the corner of the barn and watched. Whitmore got out before the carriage had fully stopped. He was dressed well, but there was something off about him, a tightness in his movements, a forward lean to his walk that suggested urgency or agitation or some combination of both. He went straight to the front door and knocked in a way that was one step below pounding. Nathan stayed where he was. The housekeeper, Clara, opened the door. There was a brief exchange Nathan couldn't hear at the distance, and then Whitmore was inside. Nathan went back to checking fence. 14 minutes later, by his rough estimate, the sound from inside the house became audible. Not words, but raised voices. One of them was Whitmore's. The other was Silas's. There was a third voice, lower and quieter, that Nathan identified after a moment as Evelyn's. He stopped checking fence and stood still, not because he was trying to listen, but because he was trying to determine whether the quality of what he was hearing required him to do something. The voices inside the house were not the voices of a negotiation going poorly. They were the voices of a disagreement that had already become something harder. He heard the front door open. He heard Evelyn say, with a clarity that the morning air carried cleanly across the yard, "You will not come here and make that kind of ultimatum in my father's house, Gerald. I don't care what your father promised yours." Then Whitmore's voice, lower but still carrying, "Evelyn, this isn't... You're not understanding the business dimension." "I understand the business dimension perfectly well," she said. "Better than you think I do. And I'm telling you that my answer has nothing to do with business and never will." A pause. Then Whitmore said something Nathan couldn't quite catch, and the quality of it, the clipped, reduced sound of a man running low on patience, made Nathan take 2 steps toward the house before he stopped himself. "That is enough," Silas said, from somewhere close to the door. His voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised, actually. The controlled, deliberate flatness of a man who is very angry and has decided that anger is a tool, not a reaction. "You will take your carriage back down that road. We can discuss your father's arrangement at a reasonable time with reasonable notice, and you will not come to this property before 7 in the morning again." Another pause. Then the sound of boots on the porch steps, deliberate and heavy, and the creak and sway of the carriage as Whitmore got back in. Nathan was behind the barn again before the carriage turned around, standing with his back against the boards and his arms folded, looking at nothing in particular and thinking about several things at once. The carriage went back down the road at the same unreasonable speed it had come in on. Quiet settled over the yard. After a while, Nathan went back to his fence check. He was on the far side of the south pasture, moving slowly along the wire, when he heard footsteps behind him. The specific cadence of someone who walks like they know where they're going and doesn't vary the pace for the terrain. "Nathan." He turned. Evelyn Harrow was standing about 20 feet behind him, wearing her work coat over what looked like morning clothes, her hair not yet properly arranged for the day. She looked, in this unpolished state, less like the woman that Whitmore and the others came to court, and more like what she actually was, someone who had been running a household since she was 12, and who treated the morning the same way she treated everything else, which was as a practical situation to be managed. She also looked like she was still working through what had just happened inside the house, the way a person does when the immediate confrontation is over, but the thought hasn't quite finished moving. "Miss Harrow," Nathan said. "Were you nearby?" she asked. Not accusingly, just asking. "I was checking fence. I heard some of it." She looked at the pasture beyond him for a moment. "Gerald's father and my father had an understanding about water rights, going back about 6 years," she said. "Gerald has recently decided that understanding extends to other things, including, apparently, me." She said this with a flatness that was not the same as indifference. It was the flatness of someone who has absorbed an insult and decided not to perform the wound of it. "He came this morning to inform my father that if the understanding wasn't formalized into an actual agreement, meaning an engagement, his father's lawyers would challenge our water access on the eastern section." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's extortion," he said. "That's what my father said." She paused. He used several additional words, but that was the core of it. Something passed across her expression. Not quite amusement, but the precursor to it. The place where a person's face wants to go, but isn't sure yet if the situation allows it. "Gerald seemed surprised that I had an opinion about the matter." "Men like that usually are," Nathan said. She looked at him directly then, with the full attention that she gave to things she was actually thinking about rather than managing. "Do you know what he said when I told him my answer was no?" she asked. "What did he say?" "He said I wasn't considering the practical realities." She said this carefully, the way you repeat something you want to examine from the outside. As though the practical realities were something I might have overlooked. As though I haven't been running this household's finances since I was 16 and my mother was ill. She stopped. "I know exactly what the practical realities are. I know the eastern water access matters. I know what it costs if we lose it. And I still said no." Nathan said nothing. "My father asked me this morning," she continued, and her voice shifted very slightly onto less certain ground, "whether there was a reason I kept saying no to men who came with practical realities attached." Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. "What did you tell him?" he asked. He kept his voice level. He was not sure he entirely succeeded. She looked at the fence wire he'd been checking, then back at him. "I told him I was waiting to want to say yes," she said. "I didn't tell him the rest of it." The morning air moved between them. "What's the rest of it?" Nathan asked. He asked it the way he did most things, without decoration, which made it more direct than he perhaps intended. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. "I think you probably know," she said. And then, before he could formulate a response to that, she turned and walked back toward the house, her footsteps the same deliberate, unhurried pace as when she'd come. Nathan stood at the fence line and watched her go. He stayed there for a while after she was gone, one hand on the wire, and he thought about the fact that Evelyn Harrow had just said something that required a response and had walked away without waiting for one. He wasn't sure whether that was generous or difficult. He concluded after a moment that it was probably both, and that this was consistent with everything else he knew about her. He went back to the main barn after a while, and he was cleaning tack when Walt found him. Walt Greer had been foreman of the Harrow Ranch for 11 years. He was a compact, bow-legged man in his mid-50s who wore the same hat regardless of season and spoke in a specific economy of words that Nathan respected because it came from the same source his own did. Not social awkwardness, but the preference for meaning what you say rather than filling space. He leaned against the barn door and watched Nathan work for a minute. "Heard Whitmore came in this morning," Walt said. "He did. Heard it went sideways." "Seemed that way." Walt crossed his arms. "Silas talked to you yesterday?" Nathan ran the cloth along the saddle leather. "He did." "You going to do something about it?" Nathan looked up. "He tell you what we talked about?" "Didn't have to. I've got eyes." Walt picked up a piece of straw from the floor and looked at it with no real interest. "Been watching you try not to watch her for 2 years. Gets a little exhausting to observe." Nathan set down the cloth. "I don't have anything to offer her, Walt." Walt dropped the straw. "Nathan," he said, with the patience of a man who has had to explain the same obvious thing too many times, "I have worked this ranch for 11 years. I have watched Silas Harrow turn down men with deeds to half of Laramie County because they didn't have whatever it was he was looking for. I have also watched you for 3 years, and I am going to tell you something as plainly as I know how to say it." He looked at him steadily. "Silas Harrow does not waste his time. He tested you 4 different ways over 14 months because he already suspected what he was going to find, and he wanted to be certain before he acted on it. The man does not spend 14 months on a question that doesn't matter to him." Nathan was quiet. "There's also the water rights problem," Walt added. "The Whitmore thing. It's not trivial. That eastern section feeds about 400 acres during dry years. Losing the access doesn't cripple us, but it costs." He said this in the tone of a man reporting facts rather than advocating for a position. "Silas has got lawyers who can probably hold it off, but lawyers cost money too, and Whitmore's father has spent 30 years knowing which legal pressure points hurt ranchers in this territory." He paused. "Not saying that's a reason, saying it's a context." "I'm not going to marry into a ranch to solve a water rights problem," Nathan said, and the edge in his voice was quiet but definite. "No," Walt said. "I know that, and I'm not suggesting it. I'm suggesting that the situation is complicated in several directions at once, and that standing still in complicated situations is also a choice, and not always the safest one." He pushed off the barn door. "Talk to her," he said. "That's all I'm saying. Talk to her like you'd want someone to talk to you if the positions were reversed." He walked out. Nathan sat alone in the barn, with the saddle half cleaned and the morning getting older around him. He thought about what Evelyn had said at the fence line. "I think you probably know." He thought about what Silas had said in the office. It ought to be her choice to make. He thought about Walt, who had called out his 2 years of careful, deliberate distance and named it for what it partly was. Not just restraint, but avoidance dressed up as restraint. He picked up the cloth and finished cleaning the saddle. Then he went and found the ledger he kept, opened it to a blank page and wrote at the top, "Things I can actually offer." He stared at the page for a while. Then he started writing. He didn't write beautifully. He wrote in the same terse, practical shorthand he used for everything else: fence conditions, horse health, materials inventories. But he wrote honestly, which was the only way he knew how to write anything, and when he was done, the page had a list on it that was shorter than he'd been telling himself it was. Not wealthy, not long, but not nothing. He closed the ledger. He had work to do for the rest of the day. The afternoon rotation of the cattle in the north pasture, and there was a broken wheel spoke on the hay wagon that needed addressing before it became a wheel, and he did all of it with the particular focus of a man who has made a decision and is now just getting through the time between the decision and the action. Gerald Whitmore came back at 4 o'clock. Not to the house this time. He came directly to the barn, which meant he had been watching, or someone had told him where Nathan worked. I was alone. His driver had presumably waited at the gate, and he came in without announcing himself, the way he did everything, as though the fact of his arrival was the only announcement required. Nathan was addressing the wagon wheel. He heard Whitmore come in. He did not immediately turn around. "You're Cole," Whitmore said. Nathan set down the tool he was holding, stood up, and turned around. "I am," he said. Whitmore was looking at him the way a man looks at something he's been given a report on and is now assessing in person. His eyes moved over Nathan with a quick, calculating inventory. The worn clothes, the work-roughened hands, the absence of anything that cost money. I've been told, Whitmore said, choosing his words with a specificity that told Nathan he'd rehearsed this, that Silas Harrow has been spending time with you, privately. We've spoken, yes, Nathan said. About his daughter. Nathan said nothing. Whitmore clasped his hands behind his back. He had the posture of a man accustomed to negotiations, the stance that says, I am in control of this conversation without saying it directly. I want to be straightforward with you, he said, which Nathan noted was exactly what a man said when he was about to be something other than straightforward. The arrangement between the Harrow and Whitmore families has existed for 6 years. There are legal documents that frame the water rights agreement in terms that could be interpreted as conditional on a closer family alliance. My father's lawyers are very good at interpretation. I've heard that, Nathan said. What I'm telling you, Whitmore continued, is that this situation is more complicated than Silas may have led you to believe. There are financial and legal dimensions here that, no offense intended, a ranch hand isn't positioned to navigate or provide protection against. He let that sit. Nathan looked at him. What exactly are you asking me? He said. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. I'm asking you to consider whether pursuing something in this direction is in the best interest of the family you claim to care about, he said. Because the complications I'm describing don't go away on the basis of good intentions. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He picked up the tool he'd set down, turned it in his hand once, and looked at Gerald Whitmore with a steadiness that Whitmore, to his credit, seemed to find slightly unnerving. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell anyone who came in here to suggest that what's good for the Harrow family happens to align exactly with what's good for Gerald Whitmore. That kind of coincidence usually isn't one. Whitmore's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake, he said. Might be, Nathan said. I've made them before. I don't generally make them because someone warned me the other direction was more expensive. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the barn without another word, the same way he'd come in, and the sound of his footsteps on the hard earth faded in the direction of the gate. Nathan stood in the barn. He realized, with the particular clarity that follows confrontation, that he had just made his position considerably less ambiguous. Not to Evelyn, not yet, but to himself. Because you could tell a man like Whitmore that you intended to do the right thing without quite knowing what the right thing was. And the act of saying it made you accountable to your own word in a way that was harder to walk back than you might expect. He put down the tool again. He found Walt at the end of the day, after supper, when the yard had gone quiet and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse. Whitmore came to see me this afternoon, Nathan said. Walt looked up from the harness he was mending. What did he want? To tell me the situation was complicated. Walt set down the harness. What did you tell him? That I noticed. Walt made a sound that was almost a laugh. And? He said. And I think I need to talk to Evelyn, Nathan said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Walt looked at him for a moment. Garden's around the south side of the house, he said. She reads out there most evenings until the light goes. Tonight's clear. I know where the garden is, Nathan said. I know you know, Walt said. I'm just giving you an excuse to leave. Nathan looked at him. Thank you, Walt, he said. Don't thank me, Walt said, picking the harness back up. Just don't stand out there in the dark for 2 hours without saying anything like you did 3 nights ago. Nathan went still. You too? He said. Walt didn't look up from the harness. Go talk to the woman, Nathan. He went. The garden was on the south side of the house, bounded on 2 sides by a low stone wall that Evelyn had apparently built herself, according to the story Walt had told once about the summer 3 years ago, when she'd decided the previous boundary was inadequate and had addressed the situation without asking anyone's opinion. There were late-season flowers still holding on in the cold, and the vegetable beds had been cleared and turned for winter. The dark soil squared off with the particular precision of someone who finds order satisfying rather than merely functional. She was sitting on a wooden bench against the inner wall with a book open on her lap, a lantern beside her on the stone. The light made the page bright and left the rest of the garden in the long shadows of early evening. She looked up when she heard him come around the corner. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been fairly certain something was coming and had decided to be ready for it. Nathan, she said. He stopped a few feet from the bench. Miss Harrow? She closed the book but kept her finger in the page, the way you do when you're not sure how long the interruption will last. Whitmore came to see you, she said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast, he said. Clara saw his carriage stop at the barn. She told my father. My father told me. She paused. What did he say? He told me the situation was complicated. It is complicated, she said. That part he's right about. Nathan sat down on the stone wall across from the bench. It was lower than the bench and put him at an angle to her, which was not ideal, but the alternative was standing over her, and that was worse. I know about the water rights, he said. Walt told me the basic shape of it. Then you know it's not a small thing. I do. She was quiet. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly, without considering what you think I want to hear. She looked at him steadily. I generally do that anyway. I know. He put his hands on his knees and looked at them for a moment, then back up. This morning at the fence line, you said you were waiting to want to say yes to someone, and you said you didn't tell your father the rest of it. I remember what I said. I'm asking you what the rest of it was. The lantern flame moved in a small breath of wind and steadied again. Evelyn looked at him with the full, undeflected attention that he had learned over 3 years meant she was deciding something rather than already having decided it. The rest of it, she said, is that I have been watching you since your 2nd month on this ranch. Not the way you watch someone you're interested in. Or not only that, the way you watch someone to understand how they actually work. Because I've watched a lot of men come through here, and I've learned that what they do when no one's checking is the only information that matters. She paused. I watched you find the money in the tack room. I happened to be in the hayloft and you didn't know I was there. I watched you spend 2 full days walking a fence line before you touched a single post, because you wanted to understand the terrain first. I watched you sit with a horse for an hour once, the gray one, Samson, who was having a bad day. And I watched you not do anything except be there, because sometimes that's what's needed, and you knew it. She looked at him. I have watched a man who does the right thing when it costs something and not just when it's easy, and I have spent 12 months trying to talk myself out of the conclusions I kept arriving at. Nathan said nothing. And then Gerald Whitmore stands on my porch at 7 in the morning and tells me I'm not considering the practical realities, she said. And I think the practical reality is that the man I cannot stop thinking about is too busy deciding what he deserves to notice that someone else has already decided. The garden was very quiet. Evelyn, Nathan said, and his voice had something in it that he didn't fully manage to keep out. I have nothing to... If you finish that sentence, she said, I'm going to ask you to leave and come back when you have something different to say. He stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was also not patient in the way that comes from not caring. It was the impatience of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing for a specific amount of time and has arrived at the end of her willingness to wait quietly. Tell me something true, she said. Not what you can or can't offer. Not what I deserve or don't deserve. Something true. Nathan sat on the stone wall in the last of the evening light, with the lantern between them and the cold coming down from the north the way it did in October in Wyoming, and he thought about the page in his ledger and what he'd written on it, and he thought about what Silas had said, and he thought about the 17 cents on the corner of the desk. I think about you, he said. Every day, in varying degrees, I think about you. I have thought about the way you think, about the way you argue with books in the margins, about the way you knew every hand on this ranch by name within 2 weeks of my arriving here, and you still remember which ones have families somewhere else. He stopped. I have thought about you, and I have spent a considerable effort not doing anything about it because I couldn't see a way in which it was fair to you. And I'm not entirely certain, sitting here right now, that it is. She looked at him for a long moment. That's honest, she said. I'm told that's my best quality. Something moved across her expression, the flicker of something real breaking through the composed surface of it. It's not your only one, she said quietly. The wind came through the garden again, and the lantern flame moved and held, and above them the Wyoming sky had gone dark enough to show stars at the edges of the east. I'm going to have to figure out the Whitmore situation, she said after a while. That's separate from everything else, but it's real. I know. And you don't have land. I know that too. And my father is going to ask you approximately 900 more questions. Probably deserves to, Nathan said. She looked at him. But you're not walking away, she said. It wasn't a question, but it required an answer. No, Nathan said. I'm not. She nodded once, the way she did when she filed something into the category of settled matters, and she opened her book back to the page she'd been holding and looked down at it. He understood that this meant the conversation was over for tonight. Not badly over, not unresolved in the painful sense, but set down the way you set down a tool you'll need to pick back up in the morning. They were practical people, both of them, and practical people understood that a thing decided is not the same as a thing done, and that the work still waiting for them tomorrow was real, regardless of what had shifted in a garden on a cold October evening. He stood up. I'll say good night, he said. Good night, Nathan, she said, without looking up from her book. He walked back around the corner of the house. The night was fully dark now, the stars hard and clear the way they got in Wyoming when the air went cold and dry. The bunkhouse windows showed light. Somewhere in the north pasture a cow was calling, a long, hollow sound that carried a long way in the still air. He stood in the yard for a minute and breathed. Then he walked to the bunkhouse, went to his bunk, and lay down. This time he slept. He slept, but the problem didn't. The Whitmore situation, as Evelyn had named it with the particular precision she applied to things she intended to solve, sat over the Harrow Ranch like weather coming in from the north. Not yet arrived, but visible on the horizon, and the kind of formation that experienced people take seriously. Silas took it seriously. Nathan could see that in the change in him over the following days. Not a dramatic change, not the visible agitation of a man losing his footing, but the particular compression of a man who has absorbed a threat and is now carrying it while he decides what to do about it. He moved through his days the same as always, made his decisions the same as always, but there was a weight in his stillness that Nathan recognized because he had seen it in himself. Walt said nothing about it directly, which was how Walt communicated that a thing was serious. The eastern water access fed a section of the ranch that didn't look impressive on a map. 400 acres of mixed grass and rocky ground that would never be the most productive part of the Harrow operation. But during a dry summer, which Wyoming produced with reliable frequency, that water was the difference between grazing 400 head on that section or pulling them off entirely. Pulling them off meant compressing the herd onto the sections with more reliable water, which meant overgrazing those sections, which meant soil damage that took years to recover from. Silas knew this arithmetic the way he knew his own name, and the Whitmore lawyers apparently knew he knew it. Nathan did not understand all the legal dimensions. He was not a lawyer, and he did not pretend to be. But he understood leverage, and he understood that a man who applies leverage to a negotiation involving someone's daughter has already told you everything about his character that you need to know. He went to Silas on the third morning after the garden conversation. He found him in the ranch office before breakfast, which was where Silas spent the early hours when something was occupying him, and he knocked on the open door and waited. Silas looked up. I want to help with the Whitmore problem, Nathan said. If there's a way I can. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at him for a moment with the measuring quality that Nathan had long since stopped finding uncomfortable. What do you know about water rights law in this territory? Silas asked. Almost nothing, Nathan said. What do you know about the eastern section's water source specifically? I know where the creek runs. I've walked that boundary. I know there's a seasonal variance in the flow, and I know the best access point is about a quarter-mile south of where the current entry is, based on the gradient. Silas was quiet. How do you know that? He asked. Walked it when I was planning the fence line, took notes. He paused. The original survey that established the water access. Do you know when it was done? Silas frowned slightly. 79. Why? Because the creek shifted, Nathan said. Not drastically, but the current channel runs about 40 feet east of where it ran in 79. I noticed it when I walked the line. The survey describes a specific channel and landmarks, and the landmarks don't match the current ground. Silas was very still. You're saying the agreement describes a water source that no longer exists in the form it was described, he said. I'm saying the survey might not match current reality, Nathan said carefully, which might matter legally, might not. I don't know enough to say, but I thought a lawyer who did know enough might want to look at the current channel against the original survey language. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a rolled document. He spread it on the desk, weighed the corners with a pen and his coffee cup, and studied it. Nathan came around the desk and looked with him. The survey was in the cramped, precise hand of a territorial surveyor, and it referenced landmarks, a particular rock formation, a stand of cottonwood, a confluence point, with the specificity of someone who trusted the land to stay where he'd found it. Nathan pointed to the confluence description without touching the paper. That confluence is about 60 feet from where it is now, he said. I can show you on the ground. Silas rolled the survey back up slowly. You didn't know this was going to matter when you walked that fence line, Chuck, he said. No, sir. You were just paying attention. I try to. Silas set the rolled survey down and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man revising a calculation. I'll write to my lawyer in Cheyenne today, he said. I'll need you to write down what you observed, specific, dated, with landmarks, the way you do your ledger entries. I can do that this morning, Nathan said. Good. Silas looked at him. Something in his expression shifted very slightly toward the thing that, in another man, would have been open warmth, but in Silas Harrow expressed itself as a kind of deep, settled satisfaction. Sit down. Nathan sat. Evelyn told me you spoke, Silas said. We did. She didn't tell me what was said. She told me the conversation happened and that she was satisfied with it, and she told me in a tone that indicated I should not push for details. Sounds right, Nathan said. It does. Silas folded his hands. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it the same way you've answered everything else I've put to you. Go ahead. Are you prepared for this to be hard? He said it without particular drama, the way he said most things, as a genuine question requiring a genuine answer, not a test of nerve. Not the Whitmore situation specifically, all of it. Running this ranch is not a romantic proposition, Nathan. It is early mornings and late nights and decisions that cost regardless of which way you go. It is watching things you've built fail and rebuilding them. It is being responsible for 30 men's livelihoods and an 11,000-acre operation in a territory where the weather will kill your cattle if you miscalculate and the market will ruin you if you misread it. And it is doing all of that beside a woman who has very specific ideas about how things should be done and who is not going to defer to you because you're the husband. He paused. I say that as a compliment to her, not a warning about her. Nathan looked at him steadily. With respect, Mr. Harrow, he said, I've been doing hard things my whole life. Not this specific kind, not at this scale, but I know what it is to work something that doesn't come easy and stay with it anyway. And I don't want a woman who defers to me. A woman who defers to me has no use for the only thing I'm actually good at, which is making decisions based on what I actually see rather than what I want to see. He stopped. I'm not claiming I'll do this perfectly. I'll make mistakes on this ranch and she'll know it when I do. But I won't make them because I was careless or dishonest, and I won't make them twice. Silas looked at him for a long time. Write up your observations about the creek, he said, finally. Detailed, dated, I need it by noon. Yes, sir, Nathan said. He stood and started toward the door. Nathan, he stopped. The 17 cents are still in the drawer, Silas said. I want you to know that. Nathan wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. All right, he said. He went and wrote the creek observations, 6 pages in his tightest and most careful hand, with compass bearings and distance estimates and the specific landmark discrepancies between the survey language and the current ground. He included a rough sketch of the creek channel as it currently ran against a dotted line representing the surveyed position. He had it on Silas's desk before 10 o'clock. Silas read it without comment and sent the letter to Cheyenne the same afternoon. Gerald Whitmore came back on the 5th day. This time he came at a reasonable hour, mid-morning, and he came alone again, and he came to the house rather than the barn, which Nathan noted as a slight recalibration of approach. He was doing the math, probably, on what had and hadn't worked before. Nathan was working near the main barn and had a clear line of sight to the front porch. He watched Whitmore's arrival without making a production of watching it. The visit lasted about 20 minutes. At some point during those 20 minutes, the voices inside the house rose briefly and then went quiet again. At the end of the 20 minutes, Whitmore came out of the house with the expression of a man who had expected a different outcome. He stood on the porch for a moment and his eyes moved across the yard in a slow, assessing arc that stopped when they reached Nathan. Nathan did not look away. Whitmore held his gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who was revising his understanding of the situation. Then he walked to his horse, mounted without ceremony, and rode out. Evelyn appeared at the front door a minute later. She looked across the yard and found Nathan without appearing to search for him, and she gave a brief nod that communicated approximately 4 things simultaneously. Whitmore is gone, the conversation did not go his way, I am fine, and you don't need to come check. And then she went back inside. Nathan went back to work. That evening, Silas's lawyer wrote back from Cheyenne. Nathan knew this because Silas found him after supper with the letter in his hand and a different quality of expression than he'd worn all week. My lawyer says the survey discrepancy is significant, Silas said. He says the Whitmore agreement references specific landmarks that no longer correspond to the current water feature, which creates substantial ambiguity in the access claim. He folded the letter. He also says that a new survey establishing the current channel would put us on much stronger legal ground, and that he advises commissioning one as soon as possible. That'll take time, Nathan said. 3 weeks, roughly. He knows a surveyor in Casper who owes him a favor. Silas paused. He also says the language in the original agreement was written by a Whitmore family lawyer and was deliberately ambiguous in certain areas. He's surprised Whitmore Sr. didn't push harder on it years ago. Whitmore Sr. didn't have a reason to push years ago, Nathan said. His son does. Silas looked at him. Yes, he said. That's what my lawyer said, almost exactly. He folded the letter again and put it in his coat pocket. I owe you something for this. You don't, Nathan said. I do. Whether you'll accept it is a separate question. He looked at Nathan with the particular directness that he used when he intended to be heard without deflection. I want you to understand something. I'm not beholden to you for this. What I'm saying is something different. I'm saying that this is the kind of thing I needed, and you provided it because you pay attention when there's nothing in it for you, and that is not common, and I notice it. Nathan didn't say anything. Go to bed, Silas said, not unkindly. There's a lot of work to do tomorrow. There was. There always was. The 3 weeks that followed were the most complicated of Nathan's time on the ranch, and not primarily because of the Whitmore situation, though that hummed steadily in the background. They were complicated because something had shifted between him and Evelyn, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted the surface of daily life, but in the way that a current underwater shifts when the channel changes, not visible from above, but fundamentally different in direction. She sought him out, now, in a way she hadn't before. Not often, not obviously, but with intention. She would find him in the course of a morning's work with a practical question, about a fence section, about the condition of a grazing area, about something she'd read that connected to ranching practice. And the practical question was genuine, never a pretext, but the coming to find him was also genuine in a different way. He found himself doing the same. He would think of something she would want to know. A spot in the north pasture where the grass was unusually good that season. A pattern in the cattle behavior that suggested something about the water quality in the west trough. And he would tell her, not because it required telling, but because he had noticed she would find it interesting, and wanting to tell her something interesting was, he recognized, a form of caring that was more intimate than a lot of things people called romantic. Walt noticed. Walt noticed everything, cataloged it with no apparent judgment, and deployed the information only when he determined it was useful. You two are doing the thing, he said one evening, coming up behind Nathan while he checked the evening water levels. What thing? Nathan said. The thing where 2 people decide something without saying it and then have 100 conversations about horses and fence lines that are all secretly about the thing they decided. He looked at Nathan. It's fine. It's actually more honest than most courting I've observed, which tends to involve a lot of very dressed up lying. Nathan set down his gauge stick. She makes it easy to be direct, he said. She doesn't want anything decorated. No, Walt agreed. She doesn't. That makes her difficult for men who are used to impressing women, and very simple for men who are used to being straight. He looked at Nathan. You're simple in that specific sense. I mean that as the highest compliment I've got. 3 days before the new surveyor was due to arrive from Casper, Gerald Whitmore's father came to the ranch. Victor Whitmore was 64, and built like a man who had once been physically powerful and had converted that power, over the decades, into a different kind of weight. It was not loud the way his son was loud. He was quiet in the way that wealthy and confident men are quiet, the kind of quiet that assumes it will be listened to. He arrived in a larger carriage than Gerald's, And with a man who was clearly a lawyer, the particular combination of good clothes and a document case identified him without any introduction being necessary. Silas received them in the front room. Nathan was not present for the meeting. He was working the South Pasture rotation, and he stayed with it because it was his job, and because putting himself in sight of the main house during this particular meeting would have communicated a claim he wasn't yet in a position to make formally. But Walt came to find him at the end of the afternoon, and the expression on Walt's face told him the meeting had not been routine. Victor Whitmore had his lawyer with him, Walt said. I saw the carriage. They were in there for an hour and 40 minutes. He paused. Silas came out looking like a man who'd just won an arm wrestling match at some cost to himself. What happened? Walt looked at the horizon for a moment. Far as I can tell, he said, Silas made a counterproposal. Instead of waiting for the survey and then fighting the water rights claim in court, he offered to renegotiate the access agreement now, on terms that don't have anything to do with Gerald marrying Evelyn. Nathan was quiet. What did Victor say? Victor pushed back. His lawyer started talking about the conditional language in the original agreement. Silas told them he had documentation that the survey landmarks no longer matched current geography, which meant the original agreement had significant ambiguity, which meant the Whitmore family's ability to enforce it in court was uncertain at best. Walt looked at Nathan. Victor's lawyer went quiet for a while after that. And then? And then Victor asked where the documentation came from. Walt looked at him steadily. Silas told him it came from a systematic observation made during fence line planning. He didn't name you. He also didn't not name you, if you follow me. Nathan followed him. Victor Whitmore, Walt continued, is apparently smarter than his son because he did the math quickly and said he'd need to consult with his own surveyor before proceeding further, which is not the same as backing down, but it's also not pressing forward. He's buying time, Nathan said. That's what Silas thinks too. The question is what they do with the time on both ends. Nathan looked at the cattle in the South Pasture, moving in their slow, deliberate way across the dry grass. What does Silas want to do? He asked. He wants the new survey done and filed before the Whitmore surveyor gets here, so that there's an official record of the current channel position that exists independently of the Harrow claim. Walt crossed his arms. He also wants to talk to you tonight. Nathan found Silas on the porch after supper, in the wooden chair he used when he wanted to think without being inside. The evening was cold, but not brutally so, and the sky to the west still held the last of the color, a dark amber smear above the black line of the hills. Walt told me the shape of it, Nathan said, taking the other chair. Then I'll skip the shape and get to the question. Silas looked at the horizon. Victor Whitmore is going to push. His lawyer knows water rights law better than mine does, probably. The Whitmore family has been doing this for 30 years and they've had practice. The survey documentation helps us, but it doesn't end it. These things can go on a long time if the other side wants to spend the money. Do they want to spend it? Victor doesn't. Gerald might push him to. Silas paused. There's one resolution that ends it cleanly. Nathan waited. If the relationship between you and Evelyn were to be formalized, Silas said without looking at him, the Whitmore family's entire basis for pressing the conditional interpretation disappears, because the conditionality, loosely interpreted, was about a family connection. If the family connection exists but goes another direction, that argument collapses. Nathan said nothing for a moment. You're not asking me to formalize something to solve a legal problem, he said carefully. No, Silas said. I'm not. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever happens between you and Evelyn happens because it's the right thing and at the right time and for no other reason. He finally looked at Nathan. What I'm saying is that there is no urgency from this direction that should make you feel any kind of pressure. The legal situation is manageable. I've managed worse. I don't want you or my daughter making decisions about your lives because of Gerald Whitmore's leverage strategies. Nathan looked at him. But, he said. Silas was quiet for a beat. But if it were to happen naturally and soon, he said, it would simplify things considerably. And I say that once and only once, and then I say no more about it. He turned back to the horizon. They sat in silence for a while. I want to talk to Evelyn, Nathan said, about all of it. Not only the formal question, about what she actually wants, what she's thought about, what she's worried about that she hasn't said to me yet. That seems right, Silas said. Tonight? She's in the garden. Nathan stood up. He went around the south side of the house, and she was there, as she'd been that first night, with the lantern on the stone and a book she wasn't really reading because the book was closed on her lap, and she was looking at the dark sky above the garden wall. She heard him come and looked over. "How bad?" she asked. He sat on the wall. "Bad enough that your father mentioned it, not bad enough that it can't be handled." She nodded, processing this. "Victor Whitmore came with his lawyer," she said. "Walt told me." "I wasn't in the room." A pause. "My father told me afterward that Victor was more reasonable than Gerald, but more dangerous, because Gerald's approach is obvious and Victor's isn't." She looked at her hands on the closed book. "He also told me that you found something in the creek survey that helped." "I noticed something when I was walking fence," Nathan said. "Paid attention, wrote it down." She looked at him. "You always say it like that," she said. "Like paying attention is a small thing." "It's a habit," he said, "not a virtue." "It's both." She opened the book and closed it again, a restless motion. "Nathan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to not be careful about it." He waited. "Are you afraid of this?" she said. "All of it. The ranch, my father, the size of what this would be. Not the Whitmore piece. That's a problem with a solution. But the rest of it." He thought about this honestly, which took a moment. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Not the way you're afraid of something you want to avoid," he said. "The way you're afraid of something that matters enough that you can't afford to get it wrong. That's different." He looked at her directly. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I've watched my father run this ranch my whole life, and I know what it costs. I know what it cost him and my mother. I know that a place like this gets into everything. The mornings, the winters, the bad years. It doesn't leave room for much else." She paused. "And I've also watched him. And I know this is going to sound like a strange thing to say. I've watched him be lonely in it, not unhappy, not regretful, but alone in it in a way that I don't think was necessary, if he'd let someone in more." Her voice was steady, but there was something working under it. "I don't want that. I want someone who's actually in it with me, not managing it beside me, actually in it." Nathan listened to this carefully. "Tell me the difference," he said. "As you see it." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise, but not that he asked, but at the specificity of the question. "Managing it beside you is, you make the decisions and you tell me what you decided, and I run the house and keep the books, and we work efficiently together, and we're polite, and we're partners in the business sense, and we're separate." She found the words as she went, the way a person does when they're arriving at a thought rather than reporting one they've already had. "Being actually in it is, you come in the door with a problem and you say it out loud before you've solved it, because I might see something you don't, and I do the same, and we make the decision between us even when it's hard and one of us is probably wrong. And sometimes we disagree and we have to sit with that." She stopped. "That requires trusting someone with the ugly version, not just the version where you've already figured out the right answer." Nathan was quiet for a long time. The lantern was burning low. "I showed your father the creek observations before I knew what they were for," he said finally. "I didn't know they'd matter to the Whitmore situation. I just knew they were accurate, and he might want them." "I know," she said. "That's the only way I know how to operate," he said. "I see something that seems true. I write it down. I give it to the person who can use it. I don't know how to hold information back strategically. It doesn't occur to me until after." He paused. "That's probably a liability in some situations." "In some," she said. "Not in the ones that matter." He looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I'm not going to be careful about it either." She waited. "If there were no Whitmore problem," he said, "if there were no legal pressure, no water rights, no reason at all except the plain question, would you want this?" The lantern flame moved. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her considering not the answer. She already had the answer. But the weight of saying it, the commitment of it, the way some things once said changed the shape of what comes after. "Yes," she said. One word, clean and certain. He nodded slowly. "Then I'd like to ask your father formally," he said. "Not because of the legal situation. Before the survey gets here and before anything else changes." He stopped. "Because it should be asked for the right reason and at the right time, and the right time is now, and the reason has nothing to do with Gerald Whitmore. She looked at him. He'll say yes, she said, but he'll make you work for it in the conversation. He'll ask you things. I know. He asked me last week whether I thought you had the temperament for a long commitment, she said. He doesn't ask easy questions. What did you tell him? She almost smiled. I told him that you'd walked 4 miles of fence line for 2 days before you touched a post, she said, because you wanted to understand the terrain before you committed to anything, and that I thought that was probably an answer. Nathan looked at her in the low lantern light. This woman who had been watching him as carefully as he had been watching her, both of them building their conclusions from the evidence rather than the hope. I'll talk to him in the morning, Nathan said. He'll be in the office before breakfast, she said. He always is when something's on his mind. I know. She stood up from the bench, and he stood from the wall, and they were close enough in the narrow garden that there was a moment of proximity that neither of them filled with words. Nathan, she said. Yeah. Don't work out what you're going to say beforehand. She looked at him steadily. You're better when you don't prepare speeches. You're better when you just say the true thing. He looked at her. All right, he said. She went inside. He stood in the garden for another minute, looking at the low lantern flame. Then he blew it out and walked to the bunkhouse in the dark, navigating by familiarity and the faint star-cast light that was just enough if you knew the ground. He lay down on his bunk. He did not work out what he was going to say. He thought instead about the page in his ledger, the list he had written on the blank page. Honest, plain, shorter than he'd been telling himself, but not nothing. He thought about Thomas Deere, who had built 11,000 acres of someone else's dream and had died without an acre of his own, and who Silas Harrow still thought about most mornings. He thought about the 17 cents on the corner of the desk. He thought about terrain. 2 days on foot to understand 4 miles of fence line before you committed to a post. Not because the fence wasn't urgent, because you could not build a true thing on ground you hadn't taken the time to know. He had walked this ground for 3 years. He knew it. He closed his eyes, and the night settled over the ranch with its cold weight and its particular silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but is instead full of things that are exactly where they belong. I was at the office door before the sun had fully cleared the hills. The light was still low and gray, the kind of early morning light that makes everything look provisional, like the world is still deciding what shape it wants to take for the day. Nathan had been awake since 4:30, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when something important is scheduled and your body doesn't trust your mind to be ready for it. He had not prepared a speech. He had kept his word on that. He knocked. Come in, Silas said. He was at the desk, as Evelyn had predicted, with the ranch ledger open in front of him and his coffee cup steaming beside it. He looked up when Nathan entered, and something in the quality of his attention sharpened slightly. Not surprise, Nathan thought, but the particular focus of a man who has been expecting a thing and is now calibrating for the actual arrival of it. Nathan closed the door behind him. He did not sit down immediately. He stood with his hat in his hand and he said what was true. I want to marry your daughter, he said, not because of the water rights, not because of Whitmore, because she's the most clear-eyed person I've ever known, and because I believe I can spend a lifetime trying to be worth standing next to her and not run out of reasons to keep trying. He stopped. I don't have land. I don't have money. I have what you've seen for 14 months. That's my case, and I don't know how to make it longer without making it worse. The office was quiet. Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he closed the ranch ledger and set his pen down and folded his hands on the desk. Sit down, Nathan, he said. Nathan sat. I want to ask you some things, Silas said, and I want the same thing from you that I've always gotten, which is the answer you actually have rather than the one you think I want. Yes, sir. Do you understand what you're asking to take on? Silas said. Not in the abstract, specifically. This ranch, at full operation, requires decisions about capital and credit and land management and labor that are not the same as the decisions a skilled hand makes. You are a skilled hand. That is not the same thing as a ranch manager. I know that, Nathan said. I'm not asking to run it from day one. I'm asking to learn it. There's a difference. Most men who come here to court Evelyn have not made that distinction, Silas said. Most men who came here to court Evelyn were already convinced they knew more than they did, Nathan said. That seemed to be the pattern. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. What do you know about credit and lending? He said. I know how to avoid needing it, Nathan said, which is a starting position, not an expertise. What do you know about cattle market cycles? I know the 3 years I've been here. I've watched the prices on the drives, and I've watched which decisions you made and what the outcome was. I've got notes. He paused. I don't have 30 years. I have 3. And I know the difference. Silas studied him. What do you do when you're wrong? He said. Nathan thought about this honestly. I find out what made me wrong, he said. Not to punish myself for it, because I need to know which part of my thinking failed, so it doesn't fail the same way again. He paused. I've been wrong about enough things to know the difference between a mistake that teaches you something and one you just repeat because you won't look at it directly. Give me an example, Silas said. A real one. Nathan looked at his hat for a moment. 3 years ago, he said. Before I came here, I was working a ranch outside of Rawlins. The foreman asked me to assess whether a section of pasture was ready to bring cattle back to after a dry spell. I looked at it for about 20 minutes, and I said yes. He took my word because I'd been right about similar things before. He paused. We lost 6 head in 2 weeks. The grass looked recovered on the surface, but the root system was still depleted, and the nutritional value wasn't there, and I'd made my assessment from the surface without digging down to see what was underneath. He looked up. I spent a week figuring out what I'd missed and why I'd missed it. I've never assessed pasture recovery the same way since, and I've never again given an opinion I didn't earn on the ground. Silas was quiet. You lost 6 head, he said. Not my cattle, but yes. That cost someone real money. It did. I knew that. That's why I looked at it until I understood what I'd done wrong. Silas picked up his coffee cup and looked at it. Most men wouldn't have told me that story, he said. You asked for a real one, Nathan said. Silas set the cup down. My daughter, he said, and his voice changed register slightly. Not softer exactly, but differently weighted, the way a man's voice changes when he moves from business to something that costs him more to say. She has spent her whole life on this ranch. She has spent the last 12 years also being the woman who kept it running while I managed the outside of it. She has done work that would go unrecorded and uncompensated in any formal account. She knows this place in ways I sometimes don't, because she has paid attention to different things than I have. He looked at Nathan. She is not a prize that comes with the property. She is not a support system for the man who runs the operation. If there comes a time when her judgment and yours are in conflict, and there will be such times, I want to know how you'll handle it. Nathan held his gaze. I'll listen first, he said. Completely. Then I'll say what I think, completely. And then we'll figure out which of us is seeing the thing more accurately, which will sometimes be her and sometimes be me. And the decision we make will be one we both understand and can both stand behind, even when it's uncomfortable. He paused. I won't always be right. She won't always be right. I won't resent her for the times she is, and I won't pretend I'm not for the times I am. He stopped. I've thought about this specifically, not just in general. Silas was very still. Why specifically? He asked. Because it's the part that breaks most things, Nathan said. Not the hard work, not the lean years, not the big decisions, the small disagreements that don't get resolved honestly. They compound. I've watched it in other households. The thing that was never said straight becomes the thing that makes every subsequent conversation crooked. He looked at Silas directly. I'd rather have a difficult, honest conversation than a smooth one that leaves something bent underneath it. Silas sat with this for a long moment. Outside, the ranch was beginning its morning. The sound of the hands starting their work, the horses at the water trough, the distant low of cattle from the north pasture. The day was taking its shape. There's something I want to tell you, Silas said. About Margaret. Nathan waited. She was the one who talked me out of selling this ranch in the winter of 1876, Silas said. We'd had 2 brutal years back to back, lost a third of the herd, took on credit. I wasn't certain I could service, and had an offer from a land company that would have cleared the debt and left us with enough to start smaller somewhere else. I wanted to take it. I'd been awake for too many nights, and I was done. He looked at the window. Margaret sat at that table in the kitchen for 2 hours with the numbers I'd given her, and then she showed me what I'd miscalculated. I'd been so focused on the debt that I'd undervalued the land itself against the coming railroad surveying. She'd read something in a newspaper 3 months earlier and remembered it. He paused. I didn't take the offer. 4 years later, the railroad came through exactly where she'd thought it would, and the land value doubled. He turned back to Nathan. I never had a proper way to credit her for that. There was no formal way to do it. The ledger shows what I decided. It doesn't show that she's the one who showed me what I was missing. Nathan understood that this was not a casual story. I don't intend to run a ledger that leaves her out of it, he said. Silas nodded, once, slowly. No, he said. I don't believe you do. He opened the desk drawer and reached in without looking, and he set something on the desk between them. 17 cents, the same coins. Nathan looked at them. I've been trying to decide what to do with these for a year and a half, Silas said. I think I've decided. He pushed them across the desk toward Nathan. You keep them, he said, not as a gift, as a reminder of what you already know about yourself. There will be times on this ranch when you'll be tempted to round down, when the easier version of the truth will be right there, and the precise version will cost you something. I want you to have something in your pocket that reminds you of what you chose when it didn't matter, so you can make the same choice when it does. Nathan looked at the coins. He picked them up. They were cold and very small in his palm. Yes, sir, he said. Silas stood. He came around the desk and extended his hand, and Nathan stood and took it, and they shook with the particular firmness of men who mean what a handshake is supposed to mean and don't use it for anything else. She'll want to be asked properly, Silas said. Not reported to. Asked. I know, Nathan said. Tonight, Silas said. The survey team from Casper arrives day after tomorrow, and things will get complicated again after that. Tonight is clean. Tonight, Nathan said. He walked out of the office and stood in the front yard of the Harrow Ranch in the early morning light, with 17 cents in his left hand and nothing planned in his head, and he thought about terrain. He knew this ground. He spent the day working, because work was what there was, and it needed doing regardless of what else was happening. He rotated the North Pasture cattle with Roy and a newer hand named Briggs, who was competent but still learning the specific personalities of the Harrow herd. He checked the repaired section of the southwest fence line that had taken damage in a recent windstorm. He ate his noon meal in the bunkhouse with the other hands, and did not behave differently than any other day because there was no reason to. Walt found him in the afternoon at the hay wagon. Silas looked like a different man at breakfast, Walt said. Did he? Lighter. Walt considered this word. Not happy exactly. Relieved. Like a man who's been carrying something at the wrong angle and finally shifted it to where it sits right. Nathan said nothing. Walt looked at him. You talked to him this morning? Walt said. I did. A pause. How'd it go? Nathan looked at him. He gave me 17 cents, Nathan said. Walt stared at him. That's the whole story? Walt said. That's the part I can tell, Nathan said. Walt made a sound that was half disbelief and half something warmer. All right, he said. All right. He picked up a hay fork. You going to talk to her tonight? Yes? In the garden? Probably. Good. Walt drove the fork into the hay without further ceremony. Wear the better shirt. Nathan looked down at himself. I only have 2 shirts, he said. I know, Walt said. Wear the other one. The afternoon went the way Wyoming afternoons in October went. The light going gold and then orange and then the long fade toward dark. The temperature dropping steadily from the moment the sun started its angle toward the hills. The smell of dry grass and cold air that Nathan had come to associate with this specific season in this specific place. He had not lived anywhere long enough before the Harrow Ranch to associate a season with a particular smell. This was the first autumn he'd had that belonged somewhere. He ate supper at the bunkhouse with the hands. He changed his shirt. Roy Demps, who noticed very little that didn't directly concern him, noticed this. You going somewhere? Roy said. No, Nathan said. Got a clean shirt on, Roy observed. Man can wear a clean shirt, Nathan said. Roy looked at him with the blunt assessment of a man who spends most of his time outdoors and has very little patience for indirection. It's the Harrow girl, isn't it? Roy said. The bunkhouse went momentarily quieter in the specific way that a group of men goes quiet when something true has been said out loud. Nathan looked at Roy. You mind your own affairs, he said, but there was no edge in it. Roy held up both hands. Not minding anything, just saying, good for you is all. He turned back to his plate. She's got more sense than any woman I've ever met, and most men. She'd be wasted on Whitmore. From the far end of the table, a hand named Caldwell said, without looking up from his food, better man than me to try it. Silas Harrow looks right through you. He does, Nathan agreed. And? Caldwell said. And he gave me 17 cents, Nathan said. Nobody understood this and nobody pushed it, and Nathan walked out into the evening. The garden was lit with the lantern, same as always. Evelyn was on the bench, but she was not reading. The book was set aside on the stone wall, placed there with intention rather than habit, and she was looking at the entrance to the garden when he came around the corner, which meant she had been expecting him, which meant Silas had said something, or she had heard the quality of the morning. Nathan, she said. Evelyn, he said. He came and stood in front of the bench. He did not sit on the wall this time. He stayed standing, which was not planned but felt right, and she looked up at him with the full, undeflected attention that she gave to things she had already decided were important. He held her gaze. I talked to your father this morning, he said. I know, she said. I want to ask you the same thing I asked him, he said, directly, without a speech. She waited. Will you marry me, he said. Not because it solves a problem, not because your father said yes, because I want to spend my life working beside someone who I can tell the true thing to and who will tell it back, and I have not met another person who fits that as completely as you do. He stopped. I still don't have land, I still don't have money. What I have is the same thing it's been. I just know now that it's enough, or at least that you get to decide whether it's enough, and I don't get to make that decision for you. She looked at him. You've been making that decision for me for a year, she said. I know, he said. I was wrong about that. She was quiet for a moment. Ask me again, she said. The plain way. Will you marry me? He said. Yes, she said. No decoration, no extended moment, just the word, the same way she did everything. Directly, with her full attention behind it, and nothing held back. He sat down on the bench beside her, which he had not done before, and for a moment they were simply two people sitting in a cold Wyoming garden in October with a lantern between them and the sky above them going dark and full of stars. My father cried, she said. He looked at her. This morning, she said. After you left the office. I heard it. He doesn't know I did. She was looking at the dark garden. He doesn't do that. He has done it twice that I know of in my life. Once when my mother died, and once when the blizzard of '84 killed 40 head and 2 of his hands. I grew up thinking he wasn't built for it. She paused. I think he was just very careful about when. Nathan was quiet. He's been carrying something since your mother died, he said. Not a question. He's been responsible for it all since then, she said. The ranch, the men, me, with nobody to tell the true thing to at the end of the day. She looked at her hands. He thinks I don't see it. I've always seen it. I know, Nathan said. I saw it too. She looked at him sideways. You noticed that about him, she said. Man who spent 40 years building something and has nobody to show it to at the end of the day, Nathan said. That's a specific kind of tired. It shows in how he moves. She was quiet for a moment. He likes you, she said. Not because you passed his tests. He liked you before the tests were done. The tests were just his way of being certain about something he'd already felt. Nathan thought about Silas finding him by the hay barn, watching him watch the parlor window. He thought about a 61-year-old man who had spent his whole life being precise about what he valued, arriving at a conclusion about a penniless ranch hand and then taking 14 months to be certain of it. He's a good man, Nathan said. He's not a simple one, Evelyn said. I want you to know that going in. He is not going to be easy to work beside. He has ways of doing things that are 30 years old, and he believes in them completely, and he is not quick to revise them, and there will be times when you're certain he's wrong and you'll be right, and he'll come around to it slowly and not say so directly. She looked at Nathan. He said something similar to me about you, actually. What did he say? He said you are the most honest man he has encountered in 30 years of dealing with men, and that honesty in a person who is also stubborn produces a very specific kind of difficulty. She paused. He said it admiringly, But he said it. Nathan considered this. He's not wrong, he said. No, she agreed. He's not. They sat for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way silence is only comfortable between people who don't need to fill it with performance. The survey team comes day after tomorrow, she said eventually. I know. And the Whitmore situation doesn't resolve itself just because... She stopped. Because we're getting married, he said. The word sat between them for a moment in the new way it would sit from now on. No, she said. It doesn't. Victor Whitmore is still going to push the water rights claim. The survey helps, but it doesn't end it. His lawyer will find another angle. Your father's lawyer thinks the creek shift creates enough ambiguity that the Whitmore claim can't survive a direct challenge, Nathan said. My father's lawyer thinks a lot of things, she said, not dismissively, but with the particular skepticism of someone who has watched legal opinions and outcomes diverge. I want to look at the original survey language myself. I've read enough land agreements over the years keeping the household records that I might see something he's missed. Nathan looked at her. Do you have a copy? He asked. My father has the original in the office. Ask him for it, Nathan said. She looked back at him. You're not going to tell me to let the lawyers handle it, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said. You've got better than a lawyer's eye on paperwork and you know this land. Why would I tell you to let someone else look at it? She held his gaze for a moment. Gerald Whitmore told me I should let the men with relevant expertise manage the legal dimension, she said. Gerald Whitmore, Nathan said, wanted you looking at the house and not at the agreement. She looked at the garden. Yes, she said. I know. She got the survey the next morning from Silas, who gave it to her without making anything of it because he had learned over 24 years that making something of Evelyn's competence was the surest way to make her feel like it was being managed rather than used. She spread it on the kitchen table and read it the way she read everything. Completely, from the beginning, not skimming. Nathan was there. She had asked him to be, which they both understood represented a shift from the previous arrangement of their days. He sat across the table and she read and occasionally pointed to a passage, and he looked at it with her and they talked about what the language meant against what the ground actually was. It took 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, Evelyn set down the survey and looked at the window. There's a reference here to a permanent water feature at a specific bearing from the southern boundary marker, she said. The creek is described as permanent. She paused. The creek goes seasonal in 3 out of every 5 years in the eastern section. I've seen it. I know when it runs and when it doesn't. Nathan looked at her. You're saying the original description is inaccurate in a way that predates the channel shift, he said. I'm saying the person who wrote this agreement either didn't know the creek's behavior or chose not to, she said carefully. If it was described as permanent and it isn't permanent, then the asset the agreement was built around doesn't exist as described. She looked at Nathan. A lawyer could do something with that. Nathan pulled the survey toward him and looked at the specific passage. Write down exactly what you just told me, he said. With the years you observed the seasonal variation. As many as you can remember with any supporting detail. Dry summer, low snowpack, whatever you can tie it to. She looked at him. Same thing you did with the channel, she said. Same thing, he said. Specific, dated, your own direct observation. Your father's lawyer in Cheyenne doesn't know this creek. You do. She picked up a pen. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she finished, she had 4 pages in her clean, precise hand. Every year she could recall the eastern creek running dry or thin, with weather context and the specific months and what she'd seen when she checked it. It went back 11 years. She handed it to Nathan. He read it. This is better than the channel observations, he said, because it's pattern, not just position. The channel shift is a single fact. 11 years of seasonal variation is a history. It might not be enough, she said. Might not be, he agreed. But it's what's true, and what's true is where you start. She looked at him. There was a knock at the kitchen doorway. Clara, the housekeeper, stood in the opening with the particular expression of someone who has walked into a room and immediately understood more than they intended to. Mr. Harrow's asking if there's coffee left, Clara said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had worked in this household for 15 years and had learned not to comment on most of what she observed. There is, Evelyn said. Clara took the coffee and left. They looked at each other. Clara's going to tell the whole ranch by noon, Nathan said. Clara's going to tell the whole ranch by 10, Evelyn said. She was right. By the time Nathan went back to work, Roy Demps had already heard something from Briggs, who had heard something from Clara's nephew, who helped with the horses, and Roy gave Nathan a look as he passed that was as close to warm as Roy's expression ever got, which was approximately the temperature of November sun through clouds. Walt said nothing, which was Walt's way of saying everything he meant. That evening, Silas gathered the household and the core hands, Walt, Roy, Caldwell, Briggs, and 4 others who had been on the ranch long enough to constitute its memory, at the big table in the kitchen. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He said that Nathan Cole and Evelyn were to be married in the spring, that Nathan would begin working alongside him and Walt on the operational management of the ranch over the coming months, and that any man who had a problem with this was welcome to take his wages and his problem to another outfit. Nobody took their wages. Roy Demp said, "About time." Silas looked at him. "You have an opinion, Roy," he said. "No, sir," Roy said. "Just an observation." Silas looked at Nathan. "He does that," Nathan said. "I'm aware," Silas said. The Casper survey team arrived the next morning at 8, 2 men with equipment and a methodical manner, and Nathan spent the morning in the field with them, walking the eastern boundary and showing them where the current channel ran against the landmarks described in the original survey. The lead surveyor, a quiet man named Pell, who had been doing this for 20 years, looked at the channel and then at the survey language and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "This is at least 40 feet off." "I measured 52, Nathan said. Pell looked at him. "You're not a surveyor," he said. "No," Nathan said. "I'm a ranch hand who walked fence lines and pays attention." Pell looked at the channel again. "52's about right," he said. They finished the field survey by early afternoon. Pell told Nathan he'd have a written report ready in 10 days and that the findings would be clear and documentable. Nathan thanked him and walked back to the main buildings, past the eastern boundary, past the fence line he had built earlier that year, past the pastures that had fed the Harrow cattle through 3 seasons of his watching. The problem was not finished. He knew that. Victor Whitmore had money and lawyers and the habits of a man accustomed to getting what he pressed for, and a survey discrepancy, and 11 years of creek observations did not guarantee any particular outcome in a territorial court. But the ground was honest, the record was honest, and whatever came next, they would meet it with accurate information rather than the story they wished were true. He stopped at the south fence line and put his hand on a post he'd set himself 6 months ago in the rocky ground of the southwest boundary. It was solid. He pulled against it once, testing the resistance. It held. He walked back toward the barn. Walt was waiting at the gate with the afternoon assignments, same as every day, and Nathan took his and went to work, same as every day, and the Harrow Ranch continued its turning around him. The cattle and the horses and the fence lines and the accountings that Evelyn kept in her clean, precise hand, and the ledger Nathan kept in his terse shorthand, 2 different records of the same true place. That evening, Silas's lawyer in Cheyenne received by courier both the creek observations and Evelyn's 11 years of seasonal variation documentation. He wrote back within the week that the combination of the channel shift evidence and the permanent water feature misrepresentation created, in his legal opinion, a significantly weakened position for the Whitmore claim. Victor Whitmore's lawyer sent a letter 10 days later requesting a meeting to discuss renegotiation of the original water rights agreement. Not a challenge. A renegotiation. Silas read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down next to his coffee and looked at Evelyn and then at Nathan. "Well," he said. Evelyn looked at the letter. "He's not conceding," she said. "He's repositioning." "He is," Silas agreed. "But a man who repositions has decided the original position isn't holding." Nathan drank his coffee. "What do you want the renegotiation to produce?" he asked Silas. "A clean access agreement with no conditional language and no family alliance provisions," Silas said. "Plain water rights, plainly stated." "That's what I want too," Evelyn said. "Then that's what we'll ask for," Nathan said. Silas looked at him. "You'll be in that meeting," he said, "not as a hand, as the man who's going to help manage this operation." Nathan set down his cup. "I'll need to read everything before then," he said. "Every document. Everything you have on the history of the Whitmore arrangement." "I'll have Clara pull it," Silas said. "I'll pull it myself," Nathan said. "I want to know where everything is." Silas looked at him for a moment, then he nodded. Good, he said. Outside, the autumn had deepened overnight, the kind of overnight shift that Wyoming does in October when it decides summer is finished and imposes winter's intentions without a long transition. The frost was thick on the grass, and the cattle's breath showed in the cold air, and the sky was the particular hard blue that came with real cold and no clouds. Nathan put on his coat and went to work in it. The ranch had its needs, same as every morning. The animals needed feeding, and the water troughs needed breaking from ice, and the day's work needed doing regardless of engagements and legal negotiations, and the small coins in his pocket that he touched once, briefly, before pulling his gloves on. 17 cents. He had weighed himself in the wrong currency for too long, and the habit was not going to leave overnight. He knew that. There would be mornings when he woke up and looked at what he had and measured it against what surrounded him, and felt the old smallness creeping back in. He was not fixed. He was oriented differently, which was not the same thing and was also not nothing. He broke ice on the first water trough. The cattle moved in around the cleared water, patient and purposeful, and Nathan stepped back and let them drink and watched the frost burn off the near pasture as the sun came up properly over the hills, slow and clear and cold. He had work to do. He went and did it. The meeting with Victor Whitmore's representatives was set for the second Friday of November at the Harrow Ranch, which was Silas's condition, and which Victor had accepted without pushing back on it. A small signal, but Nathan had learned to read small signals. He spent the 2 weeks before it reading everything. Silas gave him access to the ranch office files without ceremony, unlocked the cabinet, handed him the key, and said, "Ask me if something doesn't make sense." That was the entirety of the handover. Nathan understood that for Silas, this was a significant act, the kind that doesn't come with a speech because the speech would diminish it. He read the original water rights agreement 3 times in full and then went back and read the specific clauses again. He read the correspondence between Silas and Victor Whitmore Sr. going back to 1882, which showed a relationship that had started as practical mutual benefit and had curdled slowly, the way things curdle when one party decides the other's need is an opportunity rather than a circumstance. He read the ranch's financial records for the past decade, not because he was asked to, but because understanding the operation's actual position, not the story it told about itself, but the numbers underneath, was the only way he knew how to think clearly about what a renegotiation should produce. Evelyn found him in the office on the 3rd evening, surrounded by documents, with his ledger open to notes he'd been making. "You don't have to read all of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at the spread of papers. "What do you see?" she asked. Not testing him, genuinely asking, the way she did when she wanted a second set of eyes on something she'd already formed a view of and wanted to check against. "I see a ranch that's financially sound but not as cushioned as it looks from the outside," he said. "The cattle operation carries the weight, but the margins on the last 2 drives were thinner than they should have been, which I think is partly market and partly that the herd composition has drifted toward older stock and nobody's addressed it systematically." He looked up. "The water rights problem matters not just because of the 400 acres, but because the eastern section is where the soil profile is best for younger stock. Losing reliable water access there doesn't just reduce grazing capacity, it limits the herd renewal strategy." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "My father doesn't know you've gotten to the herd composition piece," she said. "Not yet," Nathan said. "I wanted to understand it fully before I said anything." She sat down in the other chair. "He's been aware of the herd age problem for 2 years," she said. "He's mentioned it twice in conversation and then set it aside. I think it's too big a decision to make when everything else is uncertain." "It's too big a decision to keep deferring," Nathan said. "I know." She looked at the ledger notes. "Are you going to bring it up in the Whitmore meeting?" "No," he said. "The Whitmore meeting is about water rights. I'm going to understand the herd situation fully and then bring it to your father separately when we have time to think about it properly, and we're going to figure it out together." He looked at her. "All 3 of us." She held his gaze. "He's going to resist the conversation," she said. "He's been managing this alone for 12 years, and he has ways of closing off input he isn't ready for." "I know," Nathan said. "I've watched him do it. He gets very precise about something adjacent to the actual point, and stays there until the moment passes." He paused. I'm going to be patient about it. Not indefinitely, but patiently. She looked at her hands. I've been waiting for someone to do that with him, she said quietly. Not push past him, just stay with it long enough that he can arrive there himself. Nathan looked at her. He will, he said. He's not a man who avoids true things forever. He just needs to come at them in his own time. She nodded once. Settled. They sat in the office together for another hour, her reading the seasonal variation notes she'd written, him finishing the financial records, and neither of them found the quiet uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information about what was being built between them. The morning of the Whitmore meeting arrived with the particular gray light of a Wyoming November that has decided to be serious about itself. The temperature was in the low 20s before the sun came up and didn't improve significantly after. Nathan broke ice on the troughs before breakfast and came in with cold hands and ate quickly. Silas was already in the office when Nathan came to find him at 8. They'll be here at 10, Silas said. I know. Nathan sat. Before they arrive, I want to tell you something I found in the financial records. Silas looked at him. Nathan told him about the herd composition. Not all of it, not the full analysis, but the shape of the problem and why the eastern water access was more strategically important than the surface reading suggested. He kept it brief and specific, the way he kept everything, and he watched Silas's expression move through the sequence he'd predicted to Evelyn. The initial precision about something adjacent, a brief comment about the last drive's conditions, and then a stillness that meant the actual thing was landing. I've been meaning to look at that, Silas said. I know, Nathan said. We'll look at it together, after today. Silas was quiet. You read everything in the cabinet, he said. You gave me the key, Nathan said. A pause. Yes, Silas said. I did. He looked at the window for a moment. The herd renewal problem is real, he said. Then, quieter. I've been putting it off. I know, Nathan said. It's a significant decision and the timing hasn't been right. We'll find the right time for it. He paused. But it means the eastern section matters more than the 400 grazing acres. I want you to know that going into this meeting, so that when Victor's lawyer offers a compromise that looks like a partial win, you know what you're actually being offered. Silas looked at him steadily. What kind of compromise are you expecting? He said. I think they'll offer to formalize the access in a new agreement that acknowledges the channel shift but introduces new conditional language elsewhere, something that looks like a concession but moves the leverage point rather than removing it. Nathan paused. I might be wrong, but that's what I'd do in their position. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's what I'd do too, he said. Victor Whitmore arrived at 10 minutes past 10 in the large carriage, with his lawyer, a trim, gray-haired man named Aldous Crane, who had the particular manner of someone accustomed to controlling the pace of conversations. And unexpectedly, Gerald. Nathan registered Gerald's presence without reacting to it. Gerald registered Nathan's presence in the room with a tightening around the eyes that he managed to keep from reaching the rest of his face, which was better emotional control than Nathan had expected from him. They sat at the long table in the front room, Silas at one end, Victor at the other, Crane beside Victor, Gerald beside Crane, Nathan beside Silas. Evelyn was not in the room, which had been her choice rather than anyone's direction. She was in the adjacent sitting room with the door partly open, which Nathan and Silas both knew and which the Whitmores did not. Crane opened. He was good at it, smooth, measured, presenting the Whitmore position as a reasonable accommodation of mutual interests rather than a threat, which was the sophisticated version of what Gerald had tried to do by coming to the barn and saying the situation was complicated. The language was the same, the delivery was more refined. He laid out the original agreement. He acknowledged, carefully, that there appeared to be some discrepancy in the survey language relative to current conditions. He said that the Whitmore family was prepared to renegotiate the access agreement in the spirit of the long-standing relationship between the two ranches. Then he slid a document across the table. Nathan looked at it. He had been right about the structure. The proposed new agreement acknowledged the channel shift and reset the access description to the current geography, which was the apparent concession, but introduced a clause that tied the access rights to continued good faith business relationship maintenance, a phrase that Crane had presumably chosen because it meant everything and nothing and gave the Whitmore family's lawyers somewhere to stand in any future disagreement. Good faith business relationship maintenance, Nathan said. Crane looked at him with the careful attention of a man recalibrating who he's actually talking to. A standard provision, Crane said. Standard to whom? Nathan said. I've read a fair number of water rights agreements in this territory over the past 2 weeks, and I haven't seen that language in any of the standard forms. He paused. What does violation of it look like? Who determines whether good faith has been maintained? Crane smiled the way lawyers smile when they're being pressed by someone they didn't expect to press them. It's a broad standard designed to preserve flexibility. Flexibility for which party? Nathan said. Victor Whitmore spoke for the first time. His voice was measured and direct in the way that self-made men's voices often are. No ornamentation, just weight. Mr. Cole, he said, I understand you've recently become relevant to this situation in a personal capacity. I'm here because I know this ranch's operations and because Mr. Harrow asked me to be here, Nathan said. The personal capacity is a separate matter. Is it? Victor said. Not a question. It is, Nathan said. Because what I'm asking about this document has nothing to do with my relationship with anyone in this room. It has to do with whether the agreement you're proposing actually resolves the ambiguity in the original or just relocates it. Victor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. He's direct, Victor said. He is, Silas said. I used to be, Victor said, with something in his voice that was close to dry acknowledgement. He turned back to Nathan. What would you propose instead of the good faith provision? Plain language, Nathan said. The access rights attached to the land description, not to any relational condition. The Harrow Ranch has the right to access the water feature at the current channel location, as documented by the survey completed by Pell and Associates of Casper, Wyoming, in November of 1888. Full stop. No conditionality, no flexibility provisions. The relationship between the two ranches can be whatever it is without the water access being a variable inside it. Silence. Gerald spoke for the first and only substantive time in the meeting. That eliminates our family's leverage entirely, he said. Nathan looked at him. Yes, he said. That's the point. Gerald's jaw tightened. Victor looked at his son with an expression that was not affectionate. Gerald, he said quietly. That was all. Just the name. But something in the way he said it closed the conversation Gerald had been about to have with himself. Crane spoke again, redirecting. He had several alternative formulations. Nathan and Silas worked through each one, Nathan taking the language apart at the clause level, and Silas providing the historical context that explained why each alternative version repeated the same structural problem in a different shape. It went on for 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, Crane looked at Victor with the expression of a man who is reporting a result his client isn't going to enjoy. Victor sat with his hands flat on the table. What you're describing, he said to Nathan, is an agreement with no protection for the Whitmore interest. The Whitmore interest in clean water access for your own eastern lands is fully protected, Nathan said. The agreement as we've proposed it protects both parties' physical access to the current water feature. What it doesn't protect is the ability to use the agreement as pressure in unrelated negotiations. He held Victor's gaze, which is what the original agreement became. I think we can both agree that neither ranch is well served by an arrangement that creates those kinds of incentives. Victor was quiet. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up in the way Wyoming wind does in November. Not dramatically, just persistently, as though it has somewhere else to be and is moving through rather than staying. Then Victor Whitmore said, "Let me see Pell's survey." Nathan passed it across the table. Victor read it. He was, as Silas had said, smarter than his son, and he read the way a man reads who wants to understand a thing rather than win an argument about it, which was a different posture from the one he'd arrived with, and Nathan marked it. He read for 6 minutes. Then he set it down. He looked at his lawyer. "Draft the plain language version," he said. "What Mr. Cole described. Access rights to the current channel is surveyed. No conditions." Crane looked at him. "Victor, write it the way he said," Victor said. Gerald made a sound. Victor looked at his son again with the same expression as before, and Gerald went quiet again. Crane wrote. It took 40 minutes and 3 revisions, each one Nathan and Silas reading carefully, and Nathan catching two places where Crane had reintroduced soft conditionality in what looked like neutral language. Each time, he pointed to the specific phrase and explained what it did, and each time Crane revised it with the visible but controlled frustration of a professional who respects competence even when it's inconvenient. The final document was 9 sentences. Silas read it. He looked at Nathan. Nathan nodded. Silas signed it. Victor signed it. Crane produced 2 copies. Both were signed. Victor Whitmore stood and extended his hand to Silas across the table, and Silas stood and took it. They shook the way men shake when something is genuinely concluded rather than just paused. Then Victor looked at Nathan. "You read all of this in 2 weeks," he said. "I did," Nathan said. "You're not a lawyer." "No, sir." Victor studied him. "My son was an idiot about how he handled this," he said. It was not an apology, and it was not addressed to Gerald, simply a statement of factual assessment. The arrangement with Silas's family was a good one for 30 years. Gerald decided to make it into leverage, and I let him go too far before I corrected it. He paused. "I'm correcting it now." "I appreciate that," Nathan said. Victor picked up his hat. "You're marrying the Harrow girl," he said. "I am," Nathan said. Victor looked at him one more time with the assessing quality that Nathan had noticed when he first walked in. "She picked well," he said. He walked out. Crane followed. Gerald followed Crane without looking at Nathan, which was the most Nathan expected from him, and which was fine. Silas stood at the head of the table with the signed document in his hand and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." Nathan sat. Silas sat. "I've been in negotiations for 40 years, Silas said. I have sat across tables from men who had law degrees and 30 years of experience, and I have held my own." He looked at Nathan. "You did something in there that I could not have done." "You knew the history," Nathan said. "I wouldn't have had the context without you." "That's not what I mean," Silas said. "I mean the moment when Crane kept redirecting. I would have followed him. I would have let him set the pace because that's what I've always done with lawyers. Let them operate in their territory and try to hold my own at the margins." He set the document down. "You didn't follow him. You kept pulling it back to the specific language. Every time. You were not hostile about it, and you were not aggressive about it. You just kept going back to the sentence, to the actual words." "The words are where the problems live," Nathan said. "Yes," Silas said. "They are." He looked at the window. "That is not a skill I have." Nathan looked at him. "It's a skill Evelyn has," he said. "She found the permanent water feature problem. I would have missed it." Silas looked back at him. "Yes," he said quietly. "She did." A pause. "We're going to do this differently than you've been doing it," Nathan said. Not harshly, just plainly. "The 3 of us. You're not going to manage it and pass me sections, and Evelyn is not going to run the house as a separate operation. We're going to sit at that table and go through the decisions together. It's going to be slower, and sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable." He stopped. "I've been on this ranch for 3 years, and I've watched you carry it alone since I got here, and I think that's cost you more than it's saved, and I think you know that." Silas was quiet for a long time. "Margaret would have said something similar," he said, "earlier. She'd have said it in 1882 and saved us 10 years of the other way." "I can't speak for what she'd have said," Nathan said. "I'm just telling you what I see." Silas looked at the signed document. "All right," he said. That was all. But he meant it. Nathan and Evelyn were married in late April of the following year, when the Wyoming spring had progressed far enough to make an outdoor ceremony plausible, but had not yet committed to reliability. The day was clear and cold, and the wind stayed down, which Walt said afterward was a reasonable omen, given that reasonable was about the most you could count on from Wyoming weather in April. It was a small ceremony. The hands were there, most of them cleaned up to varying degrees of success. Clara wept in the specific restrained way of someone who considers weeping at weddings a personal weakness and is doing her best to manage it. Walt stood beside Nathan and said very little throughout, which was consistent and appropriate. Silas stood beside his daughter and gave her hand to Nathan with the expression of a man who has arrived at a thing he was never certain he would reach. Not happy exactly, or not only happy, but the deeper version of it that involves some grief mixed in, because the things you most want to see often cost you something in the arriving. Nathan held Evelyn's hand and said what he'd promised to say, and meant every word of it in the practical, undecorated way that he meant things. Not as performance, but as commitment, the kind that comes from the same place as counting back 17 cents rather than rounding down. Evelyn said her part with her eyes on his and her voice steady, because she was not a woman who trembled at things she'd decided, and she had decided this completely. Silas shook Nathan's hand afterward with the grip that had different qualities the different times it had happened between them. The first time in the office, formal and assessing. The second time after the Whitmore meeting, weighted with something like relief. This time it was simply the grip of a man welcoming another into something he'd spent his life building. "Don't let me become an obstacle," Silas said quietly, close enough that only Nathan heard it. "I won't," Nathan said, "and you won't let yourself." Silas looked at him. "No," he said, "I'll try not to." The first year of the marriage was not easy, and was not meant to be. Nathan had not entered into it expecting ease, and Evelyn had not offered ease as part of the arrangement, and they both understood that what they'd agreed to was something more complicated and more durable than ease. They disagreed about the herd renewal strategy within the first month. Nathan wanted to begin transitioning younger stock immediately, taking advantage of a favorable market in the spring to sell older animals before the summer drove prices down. Evelyn thought the timing was wrong. The spring market was favorable now, but the operational load of managing a significant herd transition while also dealing with the early season ranch work would stretch the hands beyond what was reasonable, and a stretched crew made mistakes. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 evenings with the numbers between them. On the second evening, Nathan said, "You're right about the timing. I was thinking about the market and not about the people doing the work." Evelyn looked at him. "The market argument wasn't wrong," she said. "The spring prices are real. What I'm saying is we absorb slightly less favorable prices in exchange for doing it well rather than fast." "What's the cost difference?" he said. She showed him. He looked at it for a while. "That's acceptable," he said. "I think so too," she said. They presented the revised plan to Silas the next morning. He listened to both of them, asked 3 questions, and approved it. He did not make anything of the fact that it had been revised, which meant he had noticed that it was revised and had decided not to comment, which meant he was learning the new arrangement the same way he learned everything, carefully and without announcing the process. The herd renewal took 2 years. They executed it in phases, in the late summer and early fall windows that Evelyn had identified as optimal for the operations load, and they did it at price points that Nathan tracked against the market with the same obsessive accuracy he applied to fence materials inventories. By the end of the second year, the herd age profile had shifted measurably toward younger stock, and the eastern section, with its clean, unambiguous water access, confirmed by a water feature that ran reliable in the first test summer after a dry winter, carried 200 head of younger cattle through the season without a single access problem. Walt, walking the eastern boundary with Nathan in the August of that second year, looked at the cattle on the good grass with the water nearby and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "This is what you saw in the survey." "This is what Evelyn saw in the seasonal records," Nathan said. "I saw the channel. She saw what the channel meant." Walt looked at the cattle. "Between the two of you," he said, "you've got more ranch sense than anyone I've worked for except Silas, and some days I think you've got more than him." "Don't tell him that," Nathan said. "I wouldn't," Walt said, "but I'm telling you." Silas's health began to change in the third year of Nathan and Evelyn's marriage. Not dramatically. He was not a man whose decline would ever be dramatic, because he did not do things dramatically. But the tiredness started showing in the mornings, and his concentration on long documents had started to waver in ways he covered with diligence, but that Nathan and Evelyn both noticed independently and compared notes on quietly without making it a larger conversation than it needed to be yet. He had a doctor in Casper who came twice a year. After the fall visit in the third year, Silas came to the kitchen table where Nathan and Evelyn were working through the winter accounts, and he sat down and said, "My heart is not what it was. McCready says I need to reduce my physical work significantly and that I should begin transitioning the operational decisions." Nathan set down his pen. Evelyn set down hers. "How significant is significant?" Evelyn asked. "He said not to worry about the accounts and the planning work," Silas said. "He said the physical, the early mornings, the long days in cold weather, the riding." he stopped. He said, I have a few good years left if I'm sensible about it, and considerably fewer if I'm not. The kitchen was quiet. Then we're sensible about it, Nathan said. Silas looked at him. I don't know how to hand it over, he said. And the honesty of it, the plainness of a man who has held something for 40 years admitting he doesn't know how to open his hands, landed on Nathan with a weight that required a moment to absorb. You don't hand it over, Nathan said. You stay in it differently. The decisions still come to you. We bring them to you. You're at the table. He paused. What you don't do is ride fence in February, and I don't think you'll miss that part. Silas looked at his daughter. He's not wrong, Evelyn said. He rarely is, Silas said, with the dry precision that was as close as he got to humor. It's occasionally a problem. Nathan looked at him. You told me the same thing about honesty and stubborn people, he said. I did, Silas said. I meant it then, too. He stayed at the table. He stayed in the decisions. He was there in the mornings with his coffee and his ledger, and he was there at the kitchen table when Nathan and Evelyn worked through the accounts. And his presence was not reduced but redistributed, less in the body of the work, more in the understanding of it that he brought to every conversation. The following spring, Evelyn told Nathan they were going to have a child. She told him in the same garden, the same bench, a different season. And she told him the same way she told him everything, directly and without preamble. And he sat with it for a moment in the particular stillness that large true things require before your mind can properly hold them. Then he said, How are you feeling? Tired, she said, and certain. He nodded. We'll tell your father tonight, he said. He already suspects, she said. He suspects everything before anyone tells him. He does, she agreed. They told Silas that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and heard it and said nothing for a long enough moment that Nathan wondered if he'd heard. And then he stood up and embraced his daughter with the particular careful strength of a man who is managing his own emotion by managing the pressure of the hug. And when he stepped back, his eyes were wet and he did not apologize for it. He looked at Nathan. Good, he said. Nathan looked back at him. Yes, sir, he said. The boy was born in the deep winter, which in Wyoming is not the most convenient season for anything, including being born. He arrived with considerable argument about the process and settled into quietness after, with the wrinkled, focused expression of a person trying to orient to an entirely new situation. Evelyn held him with the same steadiness she brought to everything, exhausted and entirely present. Nathan stood beside her and looked at the child and felt something that he could not accurately name, which was unusual for him because he had always been able to name what he was experiencing if he was patient about it. This was different. This was the feeling of a threshold crossed in a direction that admits no return, and the irreversibility of it was not frightening but was large. And large things require more time than small things before they resolve into something you can carry without noticing the weight. They named him Silas. The old man held his grandson for the first time with the hands that had built 11,000 acres from $40 and a mule. And he was very quiet for a long time, and Nathan watched him and thought about what it meant to hold the future of a thing you have spent your life building. Not the land, not the cattle, not the legal documents in the office cabinet, but the part of it that would carry forward after you were gone. Silas, the old man said. The name. Just the name. We thought it was right, Evelyn said. It is right, he said. He looked at Nathan. You understand what this is, he said. Not a question. I'm starting to, Nathan said honestly. Silas nodded. It takes a while, he said. Give it time. He handed the boy back to Evelyn with a care that Nathan had never seen applied to anything that wasn't a living thing worth protecting, and he went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table in the way he always sat at the table when he was thinking about something serious. Nathan joined him after a while. They sat without talking, which between them had always been more comfortable than talking, and the ranch went on outside in its winter business. The animals settled against the cold, the hands doing what needed doing, the fences holding against the wind. I want to tell you something, Silas said. Nathan waited. When you came into my office that first time and told me about the $32 in the tack room, Silas said, I wrote one line in my journal. I wrote your name and that you'd found it and reported it and counted it first so you could be exact. He looked at his hands. That was 3 years before I understood what I was writing. I didn't know then that I was starting to describe the man who'd be sitting at this table. He paused. I want you to know that it was never about the tests. The tests were how I proved to myself what I'd already begun to feel, which was that you were the kind of man you don't encounter that often, and that I had been lucky, and that luck of that kind is not something you waste. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He reached into his shirt pocket and set 17 cents on the table. Silas looked at the coins. He hadn't forgotten them. Nathan could see that. He had known Nathan was carrying them, the way Silas knew most things about the people around him, through attention paid over time. You've still got them, he said. Every day, Nathan said. You said they were a reminder. Of what you already know about yourself, Silas said. Yeah. Nathan looked at the coins. There have been days when I needed it, when I was looking at a decision that had an easier version and a harder one, and the easier version was sitting right there. He paused. I take them out and I count them. It sounds foolish. It doesn't, Silas said. It works, Nathan said. That's all I know. Silas picked up one of the coins and looked at it for a moment, turning it in his fingers with the careful attention he gave to small things. Thomas Deere, he said. I know, Nathan said. You never met him. No, but I think about him. Silas set the coin back down with the others. He would have liked you, he said. He didn't give that out easily, but he would have given it to you. There are things that happen in a life that you cannot properly evaluate while they're happening, because you're inside them, and the inside view is always partial. You only understand what a chapter meant when you're far enough past it to see the shape of it from a distance. Nathan Cole had come to the Harrow Ranch with a bedroll and a roan horse and a ledger he kept for his own reasons, and he had spent 3 years watching and paying attention and saying true things and keeping his word on small matters when no one was checking. And then the world had reorganized itself around that consistency in a way he had not planned or expected or, in his most honest moments, believed he deserved. He did not believe now that what had happened to him was a reward for good behavior. He was not built for that kind of thinking. He believed instead that certain kinds of attention, the kind you pay to ground before you put a fence post in it, to creek channels before you describe them in legal language, to the people around you in the moments when they think no one is watching, produce a particular kind of clarity over time. And that clarity, compounded, becomes the foundation you can build things on. He had not been good at everything. He had gotten the timing wrong on the herd renewal, and Evelyn had corrected him. He had been wrong about staying silent for a year when Silas had ultimately had to be the one to break the silence. There were decisions he'd made on the ranch in those first years of management that he'd had to reverse, and reversing them had cost time and occasionally money, and always some portion of his confidence in his own judgment, which was an uncomfortable thing to sit with and necessary. What he had been consistent about was not pretending. Not to Silas, not to Evelyn, not to the hands who worked the ranch, not to himself in the office at the end of a long day when the numbers didn't say what he'd hoped they'd say. He had looked at what was true and said what he saw and done what he said he'd do. And when he'd been wrong, he'd looked at the wrongness until he understood it, and he'd carried 17 cents in his pocket as a private accounting of what he was actually made of versus what he wished he were made of, because the gap between those two things is where most people get into trouble. The ranch endured. It changed, in the way that living things change, not perfectly, not without loss, not without the seasons that took things away alongside the ones that gave. There was a bad winter 3 years on that cost them 40 head and 2 sections of the southwest fence that Nathan had built himself. And rebuilding what was lost cost them a year of margin and 6 weeks of the worst physical labor Nathan had done in his life. And at the end of it, the ranch was standing and the herd was recovering and the fence held. Silas was there through all of it, at the table if not always in the field, his presence redistributed but not diminished. He watched his grandson learn to walk in the same kitchen where he had made every significant decision of his ranching life. And he watched his daughter manage an operation that she had always been managing, but was now managing with the full authority it had always deserved. And he watched Nathan Cole move through each day with the same quality he had noticed in the tack room and in the fence line and in the meeting with the Whitmore lawyers, the quality of a man who does not vary his standards based on who is watching. On a late summer evening in the 5th year of Nathan and Evelyn's marriage, Silas sat on the porch in the wooden chair and looked at his ranch in the long golden light, and Nathan sat in the other chair, and young Silas was in the yard chasing something that moved in the grass, and Evelyn was inside, and the cattle were where they should be, and the fence lines held, and the water in the eastern section ran clean over the current channel that had been surveyed and documented and defended in a renegotiated agreement that sat in the office cabinet in plain, unambiguous language. "I want to ask you something," the old man said. "Go ahead," Nathan said. "Do you know what I was actually testing for?" he said. "All those months. The money, the horses, the sale, the fence." Nathan considered this. "I thought I knew," he said. "Honesty, reliability, whether you could trust me." "Those were the methods," Silas said, "not the question." He looked at the last of the light on the grass. "The question was whether you were the same person when it cost something as when it didn't, whether the quality was structural or circumstantial." He paused. "Because structural character doesn't mean a man is always right, or always competent, or always easy to work with. It means the foundation is sound. You can build on it. It doesn't shift when the weight changes." Nathan was quiet. "The 17 cents, Silas said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "That was the answer," Silas said, "before any of the rest of it. The $32 was the test. The 17 cents was the answer. Because you didn't round them off. You counted them precisely and gave them back precisely, and the precision wasn't about the amount. It was about what kind of person you were when the amount was too small to matter." Nathan turned the coins in his pocket without taking them out. "I almost didn't count them," he said. "I thought about just reporting it as $32, and then I thought, that's not accurate. And accuracy mattered even when it was 17 cents worth of difference." "That's exactly it," Silas said. The light was almost gone. The boy in the yard had caught whatever he was after and was bringing it toward the porch, with the seriousness of someone transporting something important. It turned out to be a piece of wood that had caught his interest for reasons that only made sense to a 3-year-old. "Granddad," young Silas announced, presenting the piece of wood. The old man took it with gravity. "Good find," he said. The boy looked satisfied and went back into the yard. Nathan watched him go. Some things are not visible when they're being built. You lay a post and it's just a post. You count back exact change on a trivial amount and it's just a habit. You walk 2 days on a fence line before you touch a tool, and it's just how you work. You sit in a garden and tell a woman the true thing instead of the safe thing, and it's just one conversation. And then one day you look up, and you see what all those individual acts have constructed, and the structure is larger than any one of them suggested it would be. And it is load-bearing in ways you didn't plan for, and it is holding things you couldn't have imagined on the day you laid the first post. Nathan Cole had come to Wyoming with nothing except a horse and a ledger and the refusal to be imprecise about small things when no one was watching. He had not known where that would take him. He had only known that it was the only way he knew how to be, and that varying it when it was inconvenient would mean he wasn't actually that person. He was only performing being that person, which was a different thing entirely and one that does not hold up over time. He sat on the porch of the Harrow Ranch in the last of the summer light. And the man beside him was 71 years old and had built 11,000 acres out of $40 and stubbornness. And the woman inside was the most capable person he had ever known, and the person he wanted to tell the true thing to every morning for the rest of his life. And the boy in the yard was 3 years old and already had his grandfather's quality of looking at things with full attention. It was not a perfect life, it was a true one. Nathan thought that was the better version. He thought it was always the better version, in the end. Not the life where everything resolves cleanly, but the life where the foundation is sound enough that the things which don't resolve cleanly don't bring the whole structure down. You build it post by post, decision by decision, from the quality of what you do when the amount is too small to matter, until one day it turns out that you've built something that matters very much. He took the 17 cents out of his pocket. He counted them once, the habit of a lifetime, precise to the last, and put them back. The evening settled over Wyoming the way it always had, indifferent to the people living their particular lives beneath it, but generous with its light, and the Harrow Ranch endured in it, as it would after Silas was gone and after Nathan and Evelyn were old, because the things built on honest ground have a way of lasting past the people who built them, which is the only kind of permanence that the frontier, or any place, has ever actually offered. It was enough. It had always been enough.